Welcome, everyone. I have to say I feel a little discombobulated because I'm in a room staring at a wall, and I know that there is a large group of you at the San Francisco Estuary Institute in Richmond, California, and we have folks spread out around the country sitting in their publicly accessible places as well. I am in Sacramento in our headquarters building with some of my colleagues. So I wish I could see all of you. I wish we could be together, and I know that we will be in the coming months, and I'm very much looking forward to that. It has been quite a journey since we last were together. Since that time, we have finalized the most groundbreaking set of regulations I can imagine. They are regulations that I believe met all three benchmarks that we set for them, that they are practical, they are meaningful, and they are legally defensible. The regulations now become less, or not only a legal document of difficult-to-read language at times, they become a statement of operating procedures. They become the marching orders for a group of people here at DTSC who are now going to implement these regulations. And as the regulations have changed in the sense of what they are and expanded their meaning and their reality, so too has the Green Ribbon Science Panel evolved. And now the roles of the Green Ribbon Science Panel are going to be less about deciding the boundaries of the program, which was really what doing the regulations was all about, and more about how do we take that program within those prescribed boundaries and make it real. How do we achieve the ultimate goal of these laws and this regulation, which is to improve the design and safety of consumer products? How do we achieve that goal? And your role as our advisors is to help us steer the course. We will come to you with questions on areas that we know we need your advice on, and I hope that you will not only answer those questions, but help to make sure that we are asking, in fact, all the questions we need to, and offering us areas of your expertise that we may not even be aware that we need, but you see are important for us all to be successful. So I want to start this meeting with a heartfelt thank you. I know every single one of you who has been selected to be on this panel is incredibly busy. You all represent the leaders of your field. You are all tremendously respected by your peers and by others who follow this initiative. So I thank you deeply for committing to helping me as the director and my colleagues in DTSC as we endeavor to implement this incredible regulation. It's going to be a journey moving forward. We're going to be announcing the priority products pretty shortly. There's going to be a lot of energy around that. I don't know what other word to use. Once that announcement hits, and we're going to move very quickly into how do we vet those products, how do we make sure those are in fact the right priority products, and then how do we do an alternatives analysis around them to answer the question for each of them, is it necessary? Is it necessary to make that product with that chemical of concern in it? Is there a safer alternative? And that's the journey we're on together. And I, again, want to thank you for committing to that, committing your time, your expertise, your passion, your commitment. And just know that the staff at DTSC are very grateful as well, as are, I believe, the people of California. So with that, I would like to turn this over to someone who I have to say I have tremendous faith in. I have tremendous excitement that we were able to convince her to come join us, and that is Dr. Meredith Williams. Some of you have met her, many of you have not. I can't wait for each of you to have the opportunity to sit down with Meredith and pick her brain and brainstorm on paths forward, you will find her the consummate professional, a deep intellectual, and a committed environmentalist and environmental health advocate. So she combines all those traits, and even more than that, or in addition to that, she's a musician, she's a wonderful human being, and she deeply cares about the staff who she is going to be leading in the coming years, and we are lucky to have her. So with that, I turn it over to Dr. Meredith Williams. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Rafael, and thank you to everyone who's with us today. We are very excited. It's been not just barely a month since I was officially joined to the team and started working with Carl and Amelia and Corey and the rest of the folks there. And it has been an eventful month in a really short period. But it's clear that there's a really great foundation. We talk a lot about the foundation at DTSC, and we're ready to get to work. And we think that this panel really has a tremendous role to play in terms of us successfully implementing these regulations, and we're thrilled to get going and engage all of you and tap into your expertise. I have a little time for comments a little later in the agenda, so I'm not going to say too much more than that. We appreciate all of you getting here and being patient with us as we work out the kinks. At this time, I'd like to introduce our two panel co-chairs. A number of you already, most of you probably know both of them already. Kelly Moran was very instrumental on the GRASP the last time and has worked closely with staff, advising them on both chemical selection, product lists, a number of other considerations, and really we are thrilled to have her leadership. She's been active in emerging contaminants for a number of years, heavily engaged in pesticide regulation and emerging contaminants related to pesticide use. I know her from her work and contributions to the Regional Monitoring Program for Trace Contaminants in the Bay Area, and feel very lucky to have this excuse to continue to work with her and, in fact, work with her much more closely. So it's a real gift on my end to be able to partner with you on this. Art Fong joins us from IBM. Art also has been very engaged in the process, and IBM has been very supportive in allowing Art to contribute to our work. And just want to say thank you as we kick this panel off. I think we're going to do some more introductions, and I'll let you get to that. Thank you.
Good morning. This is Art Fong from IBM, and thank you, Meredith. Well, this is really exciting for me because after a really long 5-year gestational development period, we're finally at the implementation stage. And it's actually too bad this is not one of our usual Green Ribbon Science Panel meetings because those are on video feed. And actually what you would see right now is this really geeky-looking elderly guy just pretty much jumping up and down in his seat. So sorry you guys are missing that. So I'm going to use the 30 seconds that I have to just make 2 points. First of all, I want to extend a very warm welcome to Deputy Director Williams. The panel members are looking forward to working with you, and we want to make this a success as much as you do. And the second point I want to make in my 30 seconds is I just want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of hard work that the members of the DTSC staff has done on the development of these regulations and the preparation for today's meeting. I mean, you're going to see the documents that we're going to go over. Pages and pages and pages, hours and hours and hours of work went behind that. So publicly, to the DTSC staff, thank you very much. And now I'm going to turn the phone over to my co-chair, Kelly Moran, who's going to welcome the new and returning members of the Green Ribbon Science Panel. Kelly?
Thank you, Art. This is Kelly Moran, and like Art, I do want to thank you all very much for your service to our state. It is just an honor to be part of and have the opportunity to facilitate such an amazing group. The skills of this this group are just remarkable, and the fact that each of you and some of you through your employers have arranged to be able to spend your time, and we recognize this is a significant commitment, helping our state is something that I particularly want to acknowledge and thank you all for. You all bring two things to this process. You have expertise, and it's very diverse. So each of us individually has a certain set of expertise. There's a little bit of overlap, but what we bring together is much greater than what we bring individually because we have that different expertise. We also have very different experience. So this is not a group of stakeholders. DTSC can talk to lots of stakeholders in lots of different ways, but what's unique about this group is that individually, because of the different experiences that we bring along with the different expertise, we really can do things as individuals and as a group separated from that stakeholder identity that is particularly important to help the department move forward with the implementation of the regulations. The department has a tremendous staff, but their staff doesn't have all the expertise and particularly all the experiences that the science panel members have. And so we can help the department in a really meaningful way, a very thoughtful way, moving forward down this journey of implementation of this new regulatory program. So, again, we need to bring our personal advice to the department, try to set aside the stakeholder positions as best we can so that we can help them succeed. And so I challenge each one of you in your time ahead to do your best to do that. And I personally will be working to facilitate that. We aren't always going to agree, and that's okay. That's actually one of the things the department wants to know is where there are differences in opinion among us. They want us to be able to flesh those out and understand them. Where our advice seems to lead in the same direction, that's also very informative, so we need to work together to explore all of these things. And that's what we'll be doing in the months ahead. So thank you very much for all of you from all over the country to volunteer to serve our state. I'm in great appreciation and look forward to continuing to work with you over the months and years ahead. I'd also like to very much thank the San Francisco Estuary Institute, who is hosting the meeting location in Richmond, where we actually have 8 of the science panel members this morning. It's a donation that we greatly appreciate from a public service entity that has long served the San Francisco Bay Area. So thank you. And I think it's back to Corey now.
At this time, I'd like to do a roll call, and I'll do that by location. And if there are any public present, could you just identify if there are any present? So this is the Sacramento location, and there is one public participant. And in the Richmond location, Mike Carangello, could you signify whether you're present?
Yes, I'm present.
Ann Blake?
Present.
Art Fong?
Present.
Helen Holder?
Present.
Kelly Moran?
Present.
Julia Quint?
Present.
Meg Schwartzman?
Present.
Rebecca Sutton?
Present.
Are there any public present at your location?
No.
All right, thank you. So we'll go into location 3, Malloy. Timothy, if you're there, we cannot hear you. We do seem to show you on the webinar, but we can't hear you, so maybe you can you signify in your text box whether you're present? For those panel members, the only thing I can think of why we're not able to hear you is that you need a leader passcode when you call in versus the participant passcode. Okay, so let's go on to location 4, Ken Zarker.
Present.
And are there any public present?
No, they're not.
All right, thank you. Location 5, Dr. Don Verstig.
Present, and there's no one else here but me.
All right, thank you. Location 6, Bill Carroll.
I'm present, and there are no public participants.
Location 7, Dr. Ken Geiser.
I'm here, and there are no public participants here.
And lastly but not least, Caroline Bear-Anderson.
Hi, everyone. I'm present, and there are no public participants.
All right, thank you. At this time, I think I just want to remind everyone that for those listening, that if you do want to queue up for a public comment, to press star 1, and for those members who are on the leader passcode, press star 6 to mute your line. And so next up will be the agenda review. And Kelly?
Thank you. So today's call is a background briefing meeting for the Green Ribbon Science Panel members, and the goal of this call is to go through logistics, procedures, background information about the regulatory program, basically to prepare us to make sure that our first in-person working meeting is one where we can really focus on substance. So we're getting all of this out of the way at this time. So not a really exciting agenda, but very important background information for all of us. And there will be an opportunity for the science panel members to ask questions of the staff so we can clarify things. But our goal today is not to have a big discussion of all of this, but to make sure that we all have a good understanding of the background information so that we'll be ready to go and really kick things off at our first in-person meeting. So the agenda starts with a review of the documents that have been sent out to the science panel members to make sure everyone has all the background documents. As in every meeting we have here, as we'll explain later, there will be a brief opportunity for public comment to the panel. The purpose of the public comment is not to comment to DTSC, but rather to comment to the panel, which might in the future inform our advice to DTSC. There are separate opportunities for public comment to DTSC. There'll be many of them in the upcoming regulatory process, and DTSC has regular quarterly meetings. After that, we'll be reviewing the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, which has driven many of the procedures that you'll see today. We'll have an overview of the Safer Consumer Products Program that's being implemented by DTSC. We'll have an overview of the role of the science panel and the background documents that have been provided. What are the expectations and procedures, process, how this all works. After a short break where those of us in the West Coast will be grabbing some lunch, we'll be coming back at 12:40 to receive a briefing on the Safer Consumer Products Regulations in their final form from DTSC staff. And then we'll conclude with some follow-up and action items, anything that needs to be addressed before our first meeting. We'll make sure we've got that out on the table. And we're anticipating adjourning around 1:50 p.m. So with that, we'll move on to document review.
And I'm going to just briefly go over the documents that were provided to the Green Ribbon Science Panel. These are also posted on our website. These documents follow along our agenda items today and are provided to the panel members for their use and reference during their term as a panel member. So going along with Agenda Topic 5 is the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, and provided here is the actual government code language regarding the Act, as well as kind of a plain English version of how the Act works, a handy guide to the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act. Next, we go into Agenda Topic number 7, which is the Green Ribbon Science Panel Overview. This document is a operational guidelines. It kind of provides the purpose and the processes governing the Green Ribbon Science Panel. And next, going along with along with the Green Ribbon Science Panel overview is the authorizing statute for the Green Ribbon Science Panel, the excerpt of law that establishes and describes the purpose of the Green Ribbon Science Panel. Next, we go into Agenda Topic number 8, Safer Consumer Products Regulations themselves. Here we have a number of documents for your use and reference, one of which is the updated informative digest. This document provides an overview and the intent of the regulation. And then we've provided an outline format of the regulatory text. This is kind of a same regulatory text, but put in a format that is a little bit easier to read. We've also provided the actual regulatory text. for your reference. And then we've also attached, provided to the panel members, a graphic flowchart of the regulations. It kind of shows graphically the processes that the regulations are cover. We've also attached or provided to the panel members the final statement of reasons. This is the bulk of the rationale, detailing section by section how we came about to each section of the regulations. These documents also contain a summary of all the public comments that we received during the regulatory adoption process and our responses to each version of the reg. So if you'd like to have some fine reading, this is a document that you'd like to read. It's over 400 pages. So that covers our document review. And Kelly, I turn it back over to you for the next agenda item.
All right. Thank you, Corey. And I just want to confirm that the documents that were provided to the Science Panel are also available to the public?
Yes, they are. They're all posted on our website, as well as any presentations that are being done today will be posted today.
Thank you very much, Corey. Our next item is public comment. And so this is the opportunity for public comment to the Green Ribbon Science Panel. General comments to DTSC, as I said, are not appropriate at this time. There are separate forums for that. To keep our meeting on track, we are asking that you limit your comments to 1 minute. We're more than happy to take comments in writing as well. So if someone really wants to advise us on a specific thing and wants to say more than a minute, I do encourage you to contact us in writing. The public will not be able to ask questions as part of this comment period. This isn't a question-answer kind of session. But if you do have questions, you'll note at the bottom of the agenda the contact name Corey Yep, who's been walking us through much of this, corey.yep@dtsc.ca.gov is her email, and that would be the appropriate place to send questions for follow-up with DTSC staff. So our goal here is to handle the public comments, and that will be the only public comment period in this meeting, and then we'll move on to the briefing and questions by panel members for the rest of the session. So we'll walk through this, starting with the physical locations, and then we'll go to the operator, who, if you are wishing to make a comment and you're calling in, please press *1 on your phone, and the operator will put you in the queue. So I'll start with the physical locations, and I'll be going in the order of the agenda, so locations 1 through 8, and location 1 is Sacramento. Is there anyone from the public who wishes to make a comment from Sacramento?
No, there are no commenters here.
Okay. In all of the other locations, the Green Ribbon Science Panel members reported that there were no members of the public. So I just wish to confirm that if at your location there is now a member of the public who wishes to comment, would you please identify that at this time? Okay, hearing none, I'll assume that there are no members of the public at any of the physical locations who wish to make comments. Operator, are there members of the public calling in on the telephone that wish to comment to the Green Ribbon Science Panel?
At this time, we are not showing any questions.
Any requests? There are no requests to comment?
At this time, I do not have any requests to comment.
All right. So that is the completion of the public comment period, and we will move back to Art for the next step on our agenda.
No, I think the next agenda is...
Oh, is it me?
Yes.
All right, so now we've already discovered that the chairs have a glitch. Thank you. So the next item on our agenda is an overview of the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act. And this is the act that has driven some of the procedures, some of which I've already heard complaints about from the panel members about posting agendas and access to public locations and so forth. And this is also a procedural process that we struggled with when we had teleconference meetings in the past round of the Green Ribbon Science Panel. I want to share a little story with you before we go into this because I actually asked my state senator about this. I ran into him at a party, and Art has been teasing me about that ever since, and brought up the procedural quirks and difficulties it is for a bunch of scientists and private business people who don't have public meeting facilities the way a government agency does. And so, therefore, it's awkward to participate in a conference, even a conference call that requires a public notice be posted at a specific site, and to be able to host members of the public into whatever location you're in. Some people work out of home offices or other different kinds of places where that's a very awkward requirement. So I actually just had a chat with my state senator, and he said, yes, I've actually been talking with a city council member about these issues too. And so he directed one of his staffers to look into this, and they talked to different interested parties about this. And I learned something really interesting. He called me back and walked me through what's going on here. The Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act and its local equivalent, the Brown Act here in California, is a public meetings law that's intended to provide transparency to government processes. So technically, all of us as Science Panel members are actually public officials for the state of California. Even those of you who are not sitting in California today, you are public officials. The legislature decided to include the Science Panel in the coverage of that because of their interest and desire of making our advice to DTSC transparent, because transparency in government processes improves the public's confidence and trust in the government's operations. So one of the requirements that is the most troublesome for us in this is the requirement of allowing the public at each physical location and providing the noticing and so forth at that location. The idea that a member of the public needs to be able to come and sit with you. So the reason this is part of government open meeting laws is that people behave differently when the public's watching them, when they're making decisions, and even sometimes when they're offering advice. And I've personally seen this. I was a city planning commissioner for 8 years and chaired our commission, and commissioners would say different things. I'm not clear we actually came to different decisions, but I'm quite clear that the behavior was different depending on who was in the room. When you have a room full of people or a set of different people in the room, people behave differently. The desire of having an open meeting law that allows people to watch you keeps people from going off to some funny corner of the state and sitting on the beach where no public member is watching them and doing some odd thing that they wouldn't do if people were watching them. That's the goal of the law. Our committee really being more advisory, maybe not feeling like quite the kind of committee that ought to be subject to that, there's only one state public meetings law. So either we're in it or we're out of it. The legislature wants us to be in it because they want us to be transparent, because they want the public to have confidence in what we're doing and in the program that DTSC is doing. So it's a burden, it's a responsibility, and honestly, it's an honor to serve the state in such an important role. So that's what we're going to learn about here, the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act and some of the responsibilities incumbent on us. But these were not placed on us lightly, and they're placed on us for an important public purpose. So I know it will be awkward to deal with some of these things as individuals and for our companies in some cases, but it is important to our state to do that. So I'm not expecting any change in these, and I certainly hope that all of you will join me in at least appreciating why we're going through these awkwardnesses as we have all of our meetings, whether in teleconference or in person. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Greg Lyall, who is going to be briefing us on the details of the Act. Greg?
Ooh, I need to turn on the microphone. Well, thank you, Kelly. This is Greg Lyall, and I'm an attorney here at TSC. I've been lucky enough to be here for a couple of years. I've been practicing for much longer than that, more years than I care to admit. But I'm very happy to be here today. What we're going to be talking about a little bit is the Bagley-Keene Act. As I said by the title, it's an open meeting act. It's one of a couple of open meeting acts that are prevalent in the state of California. This particular one applies to state boards and commissions. Now, for those of you that participate in local government activities here in the state of California, there's also the Brown Act. And they're both similar acts because essentially they're asking the public to come to the table and to observe and to participate in deliberations by various boards and commissions and local entities. In order to accomplish that, the legislature has set forth 4 basic premises of these acts. The first one is to publicly notice their meetings, which is really important because the people need to know when the meetings are to occur, where they will be, and how they can participate. Bodies are required to prepare agendas, which again is important so that folks know what they're going to be talking about. They're required to accept public testimony, and this may be one of the challenging issues that we have, is how do you allow people to provide testimony and have input? And as we'll see in our agenda, we already had an opportunity for the public to participate. And the participation doesn't necessarily have to be a dialogue. It can be, and really needs to be, more of statements by the public. And as we talk about later, those statements are somewhat limited in how the entity can react. And then finally, we have to have our meetings in public. So with those 4 overarching criteria, we're going to talk a little bit about each one of them as we go. Now, what's interesting here is that DTSC is not a board or a commission. So we're not subject to the Bagley-Keene Act. So why then is this panel subject to the Act? Well, we've already heard from Kelly some of the reasons why, but I also think it's because the legislature recognizes the significance of the laws that we're going to be interpreting and discussing here, and I think that really shows the import of this commission. I put forth the Health and Safety Code provision that makes it a requirement. Normally, we wouldn't have this requirement. So the legislature made a conscious decision in this case to go ahead and make the Bagley-Keene applicable. Oh, and by the way, we have plenty of time here to talk about the Act. So if you have any questions, feel free to chime in, and we'll try to answer those questions as we go. Now, most of us are new here, so there's just a couple of little things that I wanted to chat about first. The provisions of the Act apply to new members at the time of their appointment. So notice that we're having a noticed meeting here, but we haven't really had our first public meeting. We haven't had our formation meeting. But since you all received your notices of appointment, the Act became applicable to you. So then we have to look at the content of the meeting to determine whether or not the Act is triggered. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But just be advised that even though we haven't had our formation meeting, we're still bound by the provisions of the Act. One of the requirements for the Act is that you need to be given a copy of the Bagley-Keene Act, which I believe is in your materials. And there's also something in your materials which is called the Handy Guide to the Bagley-Keene Act by the AG's office. It's kind of a hokey name, but it really is the definitive authority on Bagley-Keene in the state of California. So most of us, when we're dealing with this area of law, pick that up first before we start doing any kind of substantial resource. Because if nothing else, it gives us an opportunity to figure out a starting point for our research. And by the way, if you have questions regarding the Bagley-Keene and you can't get them out of the Handy Guide, feel free to call me when we can work through whatever issues you have. Meetings. Now, one would think that this concept of meetings is a relatively straightforward idea. Government code defines a meeting as any congregation of the majority of members of a state body at the same time and place to hear or deliberate upon any item within its subject matter jurisdiction. That sounds relatively straightforward. But particularly when I was doing local government stuff, this concept of what constituted a meeting drove us nuts. Because it doesn't talk about your regular meeting that's properly noticed. It talks about any congregation of a majority of members. So that could be any kind of a social gathering or a public civic event, or sometimes people just find themselves in the same place, and they can't resist the idea of talking about shop. And the minute you have a majority and they start talking about shop, you're in a meeting. Now, I don't know that that's going to be a problem here, unless perhaps folks run into each other at a conference. So if we have a conference and more than a couple of you are going to be at the conference, you might want to talk to Corey or me and kind of run it past us. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. If you start seeing some of your fellow GRASP members at a conference or some other type of professional function, you might want to give us a buzz. And if it is kind of a haphazard meeting, please don't talk shop to the extent that you can. So the courts have interpreted the term meeting broadly. And in fact, one time, this is the whole war story, but I was representing a city planning commissioners, and they wanted to go review some projects that were outside of their jurisdiction to see what kind of restrictions and things that they could imply on their various planning things. And they decided to take a bus. Well, that became a meeting within the context of the Brown Act, and we had to rent buses that were wheelchair accessible, and we had to notice them and put them up for the public. They did that once, and other than that, it was far too expensive. But that became a meeting. So we got to be kind of cognizant of what can and can't constitute a meeting. This first one, members debating or voting on issues before them, that's very straightforward, and that's what we're going to be doing in the vast majority of our meetings. But there's another reason for a meeting, and that is when a panel receives information on matters within their jurisdiction. Now, if we were to have a meeting just about the information that you've received so far, plus my bit on the Bagley-Keene Act, that's really not information within your jurisdiction. It's more procedural. And we could have had a meeting, arguably, without publicly noticing it. But after I talk, I think Carl Palmer is going to talk about something far more interesting to y'all, and that has to do with an overview of the Safer Consumer Products laws. And that goes directly to your statutory charge. So that's clearly within your jurisdiction, and therefore we needed to call a meeting. Moreover, since you have all received your notice of appointment, now that and the Act applies to you, this is why we're having the meeting today, even though we haven't had our initial formation meeting. Now, there is a time-honored tradition with both the Bagley-Keene Act and the Brown Act of trying to avoid the Bagley-Keene Act and the Brown Act. And one of the ways that folks have tried to do that in the past is by, outside of a meeting, talking to their colleagues. So, for instance, a mayor might talk to one of the city council members on regarding an issue that may or may not be coming up before the city council, and try to persuade that person to adopt a position, and then they'll go to the second person and the third person and the fourth person. That's called a serial meeting. It's a series of communications, each of which involves less than a quorum of members, which taken as a whole involves a majority. After a while, folks started getting caught on this. Well, I'm going to talk to Joe and Stephanie and Ray, and then I'm going to get everybody to agree. The courts picked up on that one really quickly. But eventually, folks started getting a little trickier, and they started sending out intermediaries. So the mayor would talk to the city manager, and then the city manager would start polling and persuading, and that, too, is bad. So there you're kind of looking for spokes in a wheel, and if you find that you're having a lot of communications together which constitute a majority, then you've got a serial meeting. Now, this may or may not come up so much in our context, but it could almost inadvertently. Let's say, for instance, there's a seminal research paper that is just released, and one of the GRASP members say, I think we need to consider this in our recommendation, and they send it off to one member and chat about it, and then that member sends it off to two members, and each of them chat about it, and so on and so forth. We may very well find ourselves creating a spider web that could transmute into a serial meeting. So I think it's very important to keep in mind the nature of your communications. Certainly we can share information, but we certainly don't want to try to persuade people about positions outside of the context of the meeting. Certainly, if you have materials that you want to share with the committee or with the panel, send them to Corey. We'll see if we can, in fact, publish them, and then we'll send them to all of the GRASP members, and they'll be open for the public as well. And that transparency will really protect them from any kind of potential Bagley-Keene violations. And one of the things while I'm thinking about it is that the Bagley-Keene Act is as much about actual violations as the perception of violations. I mean, we see this with conflict of interest laws, and we see this all over the place, but perception is really important, and that's one of the things that the legislature was trying to address here, is that transparency and sunlight is the best antiseptic, so if we can provide the public with the information upon which we rely and keep the public in the loop with regard to our deliberations, we're going to be just fine with the Bagley-Keene Act. Now, fortunately, teleconferencing is permitted by the Act. That's essential to the operation of this committee or this panel, because we have people from all over the United States that are participating. There are some requirements. At least one member of the state body shall be physically present at the location specified in the notice of meeting. Agendas must be posted at all teleconference locations, and each teleconference location must be accessible to members of the public. Now, those are mandatory requirements for teleconferencing, and they limit somewhat where folks can actually teleconference. The meeting notices and agendas have to contain the list of all the teleconference locations, which, as you can see in ours, we have that, and the meeting requirements are relatively straightforward. All those have to be taken by roll call, which makes perfect sense, because if you just said, all those in favor say aye, and you hear a bunch of ayes, you can't really tell who voted, or you can get a decent head count. So all votes have to be taken via roll call, and, of course, members of the public have to be given an opportunity to address the state body directly at each teleconference location, which we did just before I started talking. So that being said, we have several potential teleconferencing situations that happen, and one of them is teleconferencing from home. Teleconferencing from home, I suppose, would be okay, but the home address would have to be listed. You'd have to have a home that's ADA compliant, plus you'd have to be willing to entertain house guests. So my very strong recommendation is to avoid teleconferencing from home at all possible chances. Some folks have tried to teleconference from their car. But teleconferencing from your car doesn't work because it's a moving target, and it would be impossible to properly notice that. I guess if you've got a bus, like my poor city planning committee did, you can do that, but by car doesn't work. And the last one is but from a remote location, which we're all doing now. So that one works just fine. Again, you have to post a notice at the remote location. The remote location has to comply with the ADA, and it has to be accessible to all folks. But with those protections, you can certainly teleconference from a remote location. Notice requirements. Now remember, one of the things with the Bagley-Keene Act is to inform people about when and where meetings are and how they can participate in the meeting. So there's a notice requirement that goes out. And this is one of the things that trip folks up from time to time because there's a timing aspect to it. The Act requires us to send a notice of meeting, to mail, actually, a notice of meeting to all people who have requested it at least 10 days before the meeting. And it also requires us to post the notice on the Internet at least 10 days before the meeting. Now, for those of you that are familiar with the Brown Act requires folks to physically post the agenda and the notice at a location within the main headquarters of the enterprise. There's no such posting requirement for the Bagley-Keene Act, but there is an express posting requirement on the Internet. So we have Internet posting, and we also have mail posting if folks request it. But Internet delivery of information is permissible if folks are agreeable to that as well. Oops. Okay. And then there's a list of things that the notice must contain: time and place of meeting, name and phone number of a contact person. The written notice must also include an address of the Internet site where the meeting notice will be made. So clearly the legislature has placed significant import on posting on the Internet and is moving away from the physical posting of documents, which, quite frankly, is a great idea. And we have to list all of the teleconference locations, including your homes if you decide to do this from your house. Agendas have to tell folks what's going to happen at the meeting. The legislature said, the public needs to know what the board's going to talk about so they can decide whether or not they can participate and how much they need to prepare in order to participate. But the agendas only have to contain a brief description. They shouldn't exceed more than 20 words. And one of the reasons why we want it to be as vague as possible, we want it to be descriptive so people are on notice, but the agenda dictates what we can talk about. So if we come up with a very, very narrow and detailed description of what we're going to be talking about, we can't really stray from that. So we want them to be general enough that permits us full discussion without overly hampering our ability to talk fully about an issue. If, by the way, you see an agenda item prior to a meeting that you think is too broad or too narrow, certainly bring it to Corey's attention, and we can try fixing that process. So the agenda should provide enough information. We've talked about that. They're typically mailed with the meeting notices. There's a distinction in the statute about notices and agendas. So they're separate animals, but they're oftentimes considered as a complete unit. And again, they have to be posted with teleconferencing locations. And the agenda controls the topic. Yes.
Brad? Okay, I don't know what to do. No, it's not that.
Okay. Carrying on. We can amend agendas after they've been provided within the 10 days, but there's two limited circumstances under which they can be amended. One is an emergency meeting, and one is a need to take immediate action after the need for that action came up 10 days after this. I don't think that we're going to run into that, but I wanted to include those for completeness. And we have a couple other types of meetings. The types of meetings that we're going to have will be properly noticed, regular meetings of the Green Room and Science Panel. Those will require the 10 days notice, but there are other provisions that require that can be. There are other meetings that can be held on much shorter notice. One of them is a special meeting, and these are for very limited purposes to discuss litigation, legislation, licensing, stuff like that. And I don't think that's ever going to come up in this context. Again, there's emergency meetings involving acts of God. Again, I don't think that's going to come up in this context. But for those of us that have worked with the Brown Act extensively, it's kind of, I just throw those in there so that they know I'm not forgetting stuff. Again, it's very unlikely for the grasp. The public participation is key, part of the Act. Again, the public is entitled to a seat at the table, according to the AG's office, and they have an opportunity to observe and, more importantly, to provide input on matters that are pending before boards and commissions. As such, the board or the panel can't put undue restrictions on the ability of the public to participate. But what we can do is we can set aside time in order to participate, like we've already done. And we can also set time limits on how long people can talk. When I was working with City Council, at one point we were struggling between 5-minute times and 3-minute times or 2-minute times, and the struggle became really, really easy as people would drone on for 5 minutes about nothing. So we got to the point where 2 minutes was more than sufficient, and 1 minute is okay too. However, if we find that the members of the public are raising issues that are going longer than a minute or 2 minutes, and the panel wants to hear those things, we can certainly allow for more discussion. Oh, and the meetings of the GRASP may be broadcast and they may be recorded as long as they're not unduly disruptive. And there's one more thing. Sometimes public participation can be avoided by closed session meetings. Again, this is something that's much bigger in the Brown Act. In very limited circumstances, boards and commissions can meet in closed session, namely outside of the public purview, to talk about certain things like personnel matters, where you have some confidentiality issues or pending litigation, but this is not anything that we're going to be dealing with. So as far as we're concerned, public participation is an aspect of all of our meetings. Records are another important aspect of public participation because they need to know the documents upon which we're going to rely. And so therefore, when we post our notice and agenda, we keep that in mind with what's already been given to the GRASP members, and the public should get those information as well. Now, sometimes new documents will be used or given to the GRASP members prior to the meeting or during the meeting, and ultimately those need to be provided to the public as well. And the word that's used in the statute is to provide that without delay. There's not really a timeline, but once documents have been handed to the GRAS members, there's absolutely no reason not to share them with the public unless they're somehow not applicable to the Bagley-Keene Act. And we need to make certain that the records are accessible to all folks. So to the extent that folks need an accommodation, maybe special languages or some kind of a reasonable accommodation, we need to do our best to make those records available to all individuals who want to participate in our meetings. Again, we have to operate in a manner that does not discriminate against folks and discriminate on the basis of race or national origin. Meeting sites have to be accessible to the disabled. Upon request, we can provide the documents in various languages. But we need to keep an eye on accessibility. So, we're kind of wrapping up here. And I think I want to say before we go into the remedies is that the Bagley-Keene Act sometimes is a nuisance, but particularly with what we're going to be doing here, it shouldn't be too troublesome. As long as we keep in mind what the basic premise is, which is to say to keep the public in mind and allow them to participate and to at least observe what we're doing. Violations of the Act, by the way, can include overturning a decision. Well, we don't really make decisions, we're making recommendations, but there could be injunctions to prevent future violations. In this case, somebody conceivably could go to the court and say, look, DTSC is violating the Bagley-Keene Act because they're not, properly noticing folks, and the court will say, if they prevail, DTSC, you need to start providing that notice. There could be an award of attorney's fees and costs for a violation. And last, and this is, by the way, very, very rare, but I think it's important to note because it shows the seriousness that the legislature takes is that it's possible that willful and intentional violations of the Act could subject folks to misdemeanor. Again, it has to be a willful one. It has to be a knowing violation. They're very tricky, and DAs never take these cases. But it's important to know because the legislature takes this stuff very seriously, and if they wouldn't include this type of penalty. So that's about it. If there's any questions, I'll gladly take them.
Thank you very much, Greg. So this is our first question-answer period on the new panel, and so I'll go through a couple of procedural things for those of you that haven't been with us before. I want to thank the former co-chairs, particularly Bill Carroll and Ken Geiser, for establishing some procedures that the former panel used that were extremely handy in facilitating discussions. And one of those is we'll use here in Richmond, since there are multiple of us in the room. If you have a question, take your name tag and stand it straight up like a flag, and that'll let the chairs know that you wish to have a question or make a comment. And we'll keep a running list in order of who has questions or wants to comment. For those of you not in the room with us, I will cycle, and Art will do this too, we'll cycle through all the sites to see if you have any questions, but it would be helpful if you use the chat box on the webinar tool to alert the staff that you have a question or a comment to make. So with that, I'll start here in Richmond and see, I don't see any flags. Does anyone have any questions about the Bagley-Keene? Or any questions for Greg? Seeing none, let's go through our sites. There aren't any panel members in Sacramento. So working our way down, UCLA, Tim Malloy, do you have any questions or comments? All right. Ken Zarker, Washington, do you have any questions?
One quick question. What I did is I actually posted the notice to our agency website, so it's sort of, I guess, like a cascade effect, but I did that just to help get the word out as well. Any issues with that?
No, not at all. In fact, we can always provide more notice than is required by the Act. So you should have a physical posting, but what you did was more than sufficient.
Okay.
I mean, we're free to provide more access, more notice. We just can't provide less. So it sounds to me like you provided significantly more, and I think that's great. Thanks.
Okay, is that it, Ken?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, Ohio, Dr. Don Versteeg?
Yes, no questions.
All right. Texas, Dr. William Carroll?
This, of course, is a little bit foreign to those of us in industry, but having done this for a while, in the immortal words of Bob Dylan, don't think twice, it's all right.
Thank you, Bill.
I think he's absolutely right, because a lot of us spend arguably more time than we should angsting about this, but just keep in mind the purpose behind it, and for the most part, all of those things are going to be taken care of through the proper notice requirements for the Act. So I think you're absolutely right. If you have issues and if you find yourself angsting about the Act, please call me, and we can work it out.
So next is Massachusetts, Dr. Ken Geiser.
Yeah, I would agree that we've had several years of experience with this, and I think it's been well laid out. It's just trying to live with the actual can't say the word, but the nuances of it. So, thank you.
Thank you. And in Washington, I'm Dr. Cal Beyer-Anderson.
No questions, thanks.
All right, thank you very much. Before we leave this item, I do, again, want to thank the panel for taking this seriously, and I know that you will. One other thing to remember, in addition to the Bagley-Keene Act, is that we are, as public officials, subject to the communications we have with DTSC staff, may be subject to public disclosure under public records and so forth. So it is important to think about what it is that if you dash off a really rude email, you don't really want that to show up on the front page. And as a general rule, I encourage being nice to DTSC staff. They're really wonderful folks to work with. Again, if you have things that you wish to share with the rest of the science panel, the absolutely best move is to email them to our staff, and Corey's their central contact, and she can send them out to everyone else. So then there's no question that it's gone through the proper course. So those are just things to think about a little bit. You should not feel constrained from working with the staff and advising them because of the public records disclosure laws or the Bagley-Keene Act. These are simply laws that help everyone else trust what we're doing. So,
Kelly, I do have one question. I'm sorry if this is out of turn.
No, go ahead, and you might pull the mic a little closer to you.
Oh, okay. In the last iteration of the panel...
Excuse me, this is Art. Would you mind stating your name for the audience?
Sorry, Meg Schwarzman. In the last iteration of the panel, we had a awareness of how big the panel was and how big what constituted a quorum, and that just helped us kind of keep in mind, like, nope, it's 3 people standing in a corner, we're having a brief chat, it's okay. And I know that we wouldn't want to, push the edge on it and go right up to 1 minus a quorum, but what is the size of this panel, and therefore what's a quorum?
Greg, do you want to answer that so that we don't say anything wrong?
And you're assuming that I'm going to say anything right. I believe it's 15 people on the panel, so 8 would be a quorum at this point.
Thanks.
All right, so 8.
Or a simple majority.
Okay, so communications either directly or indirectly, sometimes even through other people, to 8 members would constitute a quorum. So it is our
remember,
job.
that's how one of those serial meetings can kind of develop on its own. It can kind of snowball and do its own thing. So, 2 people talk to each other, and then 2 more talk to each other. Next thing you know, you've got 9 or 10 people that are all in kind of a similar email loop, and there's discussions back and forth about it. Now you're running the risk of finding yourself in a serial meeting. So be really careful about that. And like Kelly said, it's much easier to run those things through Kelly or through our staff, and in that way we can distribute to everybody and be very transparent with the public.
And just as a reminder, if there is something that comes up that people do think merits discussion, science panel members do have an opportunity to ask that items be put on the agenda, and we'll be talking about that later this morning. So we're not trying to keep us from interacting. In fact, we want this group to interact. So it's just how we do it. So I'll just give one last call. Are there any other final questions or discussion on this item? Hearing none, I will turn this over to Art for the next item.
Okay, just as a reminder, that did not require a roll call vote. But all right. Thank you much, folks. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to call me, and we can work through your questions. Talk to you later.
Thank you, Greg.
Great. Thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is an overview of the Safer Consumer Products program, and Carl Palmer, who is the chief of the Safer Consumer Products branch, will be giving us an overview of the program organization and the implementation status. Carl?
Thank you, Art. While they're putting my presentation up, thanks to everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk in general about implementation, about how we're organized, who we are, how we're doing our work, and what we're doing in the near term. I want to highlight that, since details are important, I want to highlight that my opening slide has a major error in it, which is that the title of our program is really the Safer Consumer Products and Workplaces program, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but it's an important distinction. But before I get there, I want to just highlight that a lot has happened since the last meeting of the earlier graphs. As Debbie highlighted and Art celebrated as well, our regulations are in place and were effective on October 1st, and we're very excited about that. We appreciate all the work that the graphs had in supporting that effort, as well as a variety of other stakeholders, and certainly kudos to our DTSC staff who did a stellar job on that. But there's been other changes as well that are important for you to understand in the context of who we are and how we work. Under Debbie's leadership and DTSC's exec staff, in the last couple of years, we've undergone a major reorganization and sort of a reconfiguration of our budget to align with our program priorities and our funding sources. And this is not trivial by any means, and it had a big impact on the programs, but I'm glad to say that now we're in a good financial status. We're aligned with how we're funded and what our priorities are. That did have a big impact on our pollution prevention program, as well as our hazardous waste management program, which were the two programs most affected by the reorganization. Our pollution prevention program was essentially cut in half in terms of staffing, and we reprioritized to focus on the implementation of our Safer Consumer Products regulations. So that's an important aspect of where we've come from, and now I'm going to talk about where we're going. So assuming this works, which it does, I want to echo Debbie's welcome and excitement to have Meredith in our Deputy Director spot. While she hasn't been here for long, I think I can speak on behalf of staff saying we're excited to have her and looking forward to moving forward. This is just a functional organization chart that shows under our program there's two main branches. One is the Safer Consumer Products branch, which I lead, and the other one is our Health and Safety program, which is led by Nanette Osias, who's our Senior Industrial Hygienist. This is really important change. In the reorganization, we moved our Health and Safety program, which was sort of an island in our admin program, into Safer Consumer Products and Workplaces. And their primary responsibility in their health and safety is the health and safety of all of our DTSC staff, both in the office, in our work environment, and in the field, both for hazardous waste cleanup and enforcement staff as they go out and conduct their work. They're also responsible for implementing the department's injury and illness prevention program, as well as establishing and maintaining our medical monitoring program. So there's a lot of work. There's about 12 industrial hygienists. But the important part from our standpoint is that because our regulations identify workers as a key sensitive subpopulation we're looking at, we now have the benefit of these industrial hygienists who, by training and experience, have a much better and different perspective of the workplace and in process engineering and manufacturing that brings a whole new set of tools to us in our program, and we're very excited about that. So I'm going to go into a little more detail. Functionally speaking, in our branch, I'm the program manager, and we have 4 supervisors, a senior engineer, and a couple of senior scientists. And then we have a collection of engineers, environmental scientists, research scientists, program analysts. We have a librarian. I put U.S. EPA support on this slide because we're blessed to have Eileen Sheehan on loan to us from Region 9, She's been instrumental in our work in coordinating information and with US EPA headquarters. I also want to highlight, they're not on this graphic, but we have two staff who are retired that are working part-time for us. One is Dr. Jeff Wong, who you know, who's been instrumental in getting us to where we are and helping us move forward. And the other one is Corey Yep, who has been our lead in establishing and coordinating with UTheGraphs, and so we're very happy to have them. The bottom box on this graphic highlights that we have a lot of other support and that we need that are critical to everything we're doing. This is in our legal office, our toxicologists, I mentioned our IH group, our information technology folks, as well as our lab communications, and ultimately our enforcement program as well. So this is the makeup of who we are. In terms of how we're doing our work, the standard state hierarchical org chart is not how we're doing things. We've really organized around the function and the needs of implementing the regulations. So we primarily at this point have four main teams: priority products identification, alternatives analysis, communications, and data management. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what those teams are doing and what the near-term goals are. So for priority products, of course, the key question that everyone wants to know is, what are we going to focus on, and when will we tell the world? As Debbie highlighted, in the next several weeks, we'll be announcing those initial draft priority products, and we're very excited about that. That will create a new vortex of information and work that comes with that, but we're very excited to make that key step. This team has been working for about a year looking at a variety of options for priority products and looking at the regulations and evaluating, collecting data that supports the criteria in the regulations, which would inform us on what are good candidates to pick. Once we announce those priority products, it's important to know that this is just going to be the start of a fairly long process to adopt those formally. And we're going to start by having workshops and engagement with all the stakeholders. We're going to put these out to the world, then we'll have information out there that says this is why we picked these things, and here's the background for that. And we're pretty confident that we'll get a lot of input about how brilliant we are or how we might be better informed with some other data. And we're going to use this as an opportunity to close data gaps, to put information on the table that will help inform us as we move forward. And moving forward will entail that each of these priority products will need to be adopted in formal rulemaking in regulation. And Lynn Goldman later in the day is going to talk about the process in a little more detail. But that's typically a year-long process. So one thing I wanted to highlight is that this is going to be a process that's going to have a lot of stakeholder input and a lot of discussion. Concurrently, we're required by our regulations to be developing a 3-year work plan that has to be in place by October of this year. That work plan focuses on not priority products specifically, but categories of priority products. And we'll be sending messages to stakeholders in terms of what's next in the queue as we consider the next round of priority products. One thing I want to highlight is that this isn't a one-shot deal. This is a process that we're putting in place which will cycle and continue to cycle as we roll out additional priority products in the future. So this has been the primary focus of this team in terms of getting to the point where we can announce the products and moving forward. We'll also be looking at, and to cut off a little bit, we anticipate that we're likely to get petitions as identified as the opportunity for stakeholders to petition us for adding chemicals or priority products and lists to our menu. And this group will be looking at that as well. Okay, so alternatives analysis. Well, one of the primary things that this group is looking forward to is the reformulation of this group, because we've identified that the GRAS is going to initially focus on helping this team through this process of developing alternatives analysis guidance and making information available to those stakeholders who will have to conduct an alternatives analysis on how to do it, how to work through the regulations, how to use good science and information, models, et cetera, and the experience of all of you and those out in the worldwide community, how to comply with our regulations. So we're excited about that. We've been on a path since adoption of the regs, and actually before that, of developing draft guidance. And this our initial plan was to this spring to come out with the first phase guidance and workshop that and get some input, and then in the fall come out with the second phase. We're reevaluating that time frame, and it'll be informed by this process and the input from the graphs, and then we'll be developing a more specific work plan in terms of timing and logistics. But it's safe to say that with input from this group, we're also going to be getting a lot of input from a myriad of external stakeholders, and we'll figure out exactly how we're going to do that and when. And, of course, it's our goal that we will have final guidance prior to the final adoption of the priority product list, so that those folks who are on the hook for conducting an alternatives analysis will have an excellent guidance document at their fingertips so they can know how to proceed.
Carl?
Yes?
Could you clarify the timing of the finalized priorities?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned before, that the priority products will need to be adopted in regulation. So considering that we're going to have some dialogue before we go to public notice on the regulation, let's say we do that spring, this summer, then if you say a year from there would be the target date for when those would be finalized. Note that depending on how many priority products we have, they may be in separate regulation practices, they may have separate tracks, but if you can get the general, we're talking about probably 16 to 18 months from now.
That's clear to everyone.
So the regulations specify that the requirements for the stakeholders to actually start the clock ticking for who has to notice us, that they're a responsible entity for that priority product, and then the timeframes for conducting the various stages of the alternatives analysis are dictated by when the list is finalized.
Is there anything that dictates whether or not they go separately or in a package?
No. The requirement is that we have to put out the list, and then we have to adopt them in regulation. We have some latitude to determine on how we phase those out, do them all at once, combine them or not. And it will be, I think, based on the merits of that priority product. Different products may have completely different stakeholder groups. There may be different issues. So there could be a variety of
And it's making selections based on, the ability to do them in group, or is that
No, the criteria for selecting the priority products is defined in the regulations, and those are the criteria we're using. It's not the logistic pragmatic side. That will come into play as we move forward to both notice them and get through the rulemaking process, which will really dictate the timing. But there are certainly logistical issues, one being our bandwidth to how many of these things we can do in what time frame, and then the input we get from stakeholders in terms of do we need to refine the priority product.
Yeah, I ask that because going forward with the work plan, you're doing things in categories.
Yes.
So that would be a natural grouping.
Yes. And there's a relationship likely between let me just clarify. It's Julia Quint who's asking the question for those on the. Thank you, Julia. That there is a logical relationship between our draft priority products list potentially and the 3-year work plan, because we've been considering other products that might be in that plan, and we anticipate we'll get a lot of input from stakeholders with suggestions of things we should consider or categories that may be identified in the 3-year work plan. There's sort of a continuum there, I anticipate, both in the near term and as the years go by.
Just a quick reminder, this is Art, for the panel members to please identify themselves when they're speaking or asking a question, because for the written records, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Art. Thank you. Next, I want to highlight what we're doing in the realm of communications. Certainly, information is the coin of the realm in our process, and it's very important that we both externally and internally manage documents, communication, information. So one of the key things we're doing is our webpage to improve the ability of external stakeholders to see what we're doing, how we're doing it, get access to documents. The webpage will also be the portal by which we collect information, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But we're going to use that. We're also working on right now in terms of our draft priority products, and we'll continue to work on frequently asked questions documents, fact sheets. We'll be doing workshops, webinars. So all of these things revolve around messaging, clarity of information. So we have a team, diverse team of scientists, engineers, information folks, IT folks working to make sure that we not only develop these documents, but we have the tools to effectively use them in the public interface, so to speak. We also, you may be aware that at the end of September, we launched our candidate chemical database and our toxics information clearinghouse. This group is also curating that as we get suggestions for adding information into the clearinghouse. And we are also working closely with our Office of Communications and our data management teams to make sure that we can effectively communicate internally and externally. I'll leave it at that. Lastly, our data management team, we're a new program, and if you're familiar with some of our other standing programs like our cleanup program or our permitting program, we have EnviroStore. We have mechanisms that allow stakeholders to get information, submit information, get updates on the status of sites and projects and things like that. So we're building a new system in our program, and those of you who are familiar with the state process, that's a very formal, somewhat cumbersome, thoughtful process that has all kinds of steps. And we're going through those steps. And this graphic is a little complicated, but I'll try to boil it down to the simple elements, which are that there's two stakeholders here, really. DTSC, our use of data and data needs and management, and external stakeholders. Those can be broken up, the externals, into two, just the general public and stakeholders, and then a subset of that, which are the responsible entities, which will be subject to the regulations. All of us need to be able to manage our data. So on the DTSC side, we need to do things like generate profiles for our priority products, do analysis and research. We need to have supporting documents for our rulemaking, et cetera. We need to be able to manage those documents, so a document management system. We need to be able to protect the confidentiality of trade secret information and CBI information pursuant to the state law, and make sure that the external stakeholders know how to navigate that system and have confidence that it is secure. We also have to have the ability for all external stakeholders to see what we're doing transparently, be able to get the data, be able to give us data, be able to search what we have. So fundamentally, we're talking about a whole system. We have a process we're going through right now, and we'll be going out for bid in the near term to get some assistance to build this system so that it will work both internally for us and externally. Additionally, it will help us internally so that we can ensure that we stay on track, so that we can manage our workflow, meet our commitments, and produce the things that we want to produce in a timely manner. So that's it in a nutshell, but it's a lot of work, and we're moving forward on that. I also wanted to highlight that we're not doing all of this in a vacuum. As we are getting input from the Green Northern Science Panel, we also have been working, we will continue to work with our partners in government, both at U.S. EPA and other state governments in terms of standing groups like the Environmental Council of States, East Coast, other groups that are a collaboration of business stakeholders, NGOs, environmental health, and others like BizNGO, the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse, and others, so that we both in terms of on the technical side, know what's going on out there in the world so that we can, for example, in alternatives analysis, understand what everyone else is doing, learn from that, develop a community of practice, and find standards within our requirements in California, which are dictated by the statute. But basically, we're trying to make sure that we don't do this in a vacuum. We learn from others' successes and mistakes, and we will continue to do that. Yes?
This is Ann Blake, and I apologize for not announcing myself earlier. A question that I've had for some time and would like to follow up here is you're talking about coordinating with other entities. Are you talking to the European Chemicals Agency, who are also in the process of implementing alternatives assessment, however, without guidance from their implementing regulations?
Well, we've talked to the EU predominantly when we were adopting the regulations. I think there's work to do in terms of getting more information, coordination in terms of assessment and analysis, but we're aware of what they're doing. And again, there's a lot of things going on out there. So we look forward to the assistance of this group to help us frame some of what's going on elsewhere too. So that's pretty much my presentation. I hope that gave a snapshot of who we are, what we're doing, our organization, and our near-term priorities. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to field.
Carl, thank you very much for just an excellent overview of the program itself and the status, implementation status. Now, we're going to go for an opportunity for the panel members to ask you and the other DTFC staff about questions. So let me start with, again, I'm going to follow Kelly's lead and go through the various locations. Actually, we start with this physical location first, right? So if you have any questions, would you mind putting your name tag up, standing it on end, and I will go around the room to, actually, we only have one flag up, so Julia.
This is Julia Quinn, and like Ann, I apologize for not identifying myself earlier. I just had a question. I really like the idea that you have workplace in your name of your group, but I'm a little concerned that there may be some confusion with the occupational health branch in the California Department of Public Health, who is the state public health entity on occupational health and who also has Safer Alternatives Initiative as one of their major parts of their program. So I was just wondering whether or not there had been any coordination, because often I've been in state government, you don't know what each other's doing. You're so focused on your own mandates, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity to, coordinate or however you do that, or certainly to let them be aware of what you're doing and vice versa. So I just wanted to ask.
This is Meredith Williams, and I'm going to start with the answer and then turn it over to Carl, because this is a larger issue than just occupational health. Whether it's the public health agency, the governor's office, the level of coordination that's needed amongst the agencies is really critical. We talked about EPA, and we have regular calls with EPA to stay aligned with what they're doing, understand what they're doing, and understand the impact of what our choices are and how we implement the regulations are on their efforts.
Right.
So that's an overarching goal of ours, is to do that level of alignment, and it is quite complex simply because of the number of agencies involved, which comes back to the breadth of consumer products. So that said, I think Carl can speak to the specifics about occupational health.
Well, I think on a couple of levels. One, in the actual writing of the regulations, we had a representative from the Department of Health as a liaison to help us with that perspective, and that was very helpful. Also in selection of the priority products. We're very sensitive to the need to both coordinate for purposes of being smart, but also not going countercurrent to any other government activity. So we have met with DHS, both Occupational Health and HESIS and others, and we will continue that dialogue. The regulations provide specifically that we're not to go counter or overlap other regulatory authority for the same purpose and endpoint. So we are coordinating, and we want to make sure that as we go through this process that there's synergy, they're not counter-current work.
And I was aware of all the efforts you've made through the, developing the regulations, of coordinating with tons of people, including state governments. It's just the name workplace in the title. Sometimes it's confusing because when people go to the state looking for services, when they see a certain word, they automatically make certain assumptions.
Sure.
So that's why I brought it up specifically with the word workplace.
Yeah,
because, they have a
very specific to DTFC.
Yes, and that's what I think needs the clarification, that it's specific to this particular program.
Right.
Because people will see the name and then think they can call and get your advice on the hot chemical X.
Right.
So which is what the branch offers. So.
Thank you.
Now let's rotate through our remote locations, starting with location 1, which I understand does not have a panel member present. So let's go to location 3 in Los Angeles. Tim, do you have any questions or comments? Not hearing anything from Los Angeles. Let's go to location 4 in Washington. Ken?
None at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Location 5, Ohio.
This is Don. No questions. Thanks.
Location 6, Dallas.
No questions, Art.
Just a follow-up on your previous comment. I think it's a pretty disturbing commentary about the age spread of the panel members when everybody knew what you were talking about on Bob Dylan.
I can't do anything about that. We've done the best we can with this panel.
Location 7, Massachusetts. Ken?
Yeah. This is Ken. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. It's a question to Carl. This is Ken Geiser. Carl, thank you for the presentation, and I want to go to the top of it there where you went through some of the staffing that the DTSC has put forward and the positions that people have held. You only went to a certain level, though, and I've had the privilege of meeting many other of the folks who are working on the program, and I'm sure we will hear from others as well in the next several years as we go on. Is it possible for you to get us a list of the remaining staff that are working on this and their positions and titles as well, so that we can properly know who they are and also recognize them in the situation that they're in?
Ken, this is Carl. Yes, I think we can give you a more specific breakdown of who our staff are and their background. So, for example, in our engineering group, we have a variety. We have chemical engineers, we have civil, we have, I think, a mechanical, and the same with our scientists. We have chemists, we have physicists now. Thank you, Meredith. So we can give some more detail on that. In terms of, there aren't other staff. I mean, one of the functions is to give you some sense, there's about 25 dedicated staff in our program and about 12 other staff in that bottom box. And we also, because some things like enforcement have not, we haven't activated those, we're using some of that funding for toxicologists and others. So we're piecing this together in sort of a matrix manner. One thing that is important, I think, in the long term, and it goes back to what I said about reconciling our budget, is that our program, as we move forward, we are tracking what we're doing. This is another function of our data management system, to understand how much work we're doing in what area, so that if we do find down the road that we need additional expertise or different expertise, that we can work through the budget process and the legislature, if necessary, to meet those needs.
So, this is Meredith, and I think your short answer, that was great information.
Yeah.
The short answer is we can get you that information.
Yes.
And I would suggest we do that before the April meeting.
Yes, certainly.
Yes, please. That would be great. Thank you.
And we might wait a few weeks just because we're on the cusp of a few new hires. So it may not come right away.
Great, thank you. Let me go to location 8 and then come back to the Richmond physical location. Location 8, Washington, D.C. Cal, do you have any questions or comments?
This is Cal. No question. Thanks.
And also, I just received a note from Tim Malloy at UCLA saying that his audio is not working, but in fact he had no comments or questions on this particular agenda item. So let's come back to the Richmond location. Julia?
This is Julia Quint. I just had a question. You mentioned in the beginning that you had decreased the pollution prevention program, at least which staff. I was wondering if you're continuing any activities in that program.
Yeah, what we did through the budget process is identified that this is the Safer Consumer Products Regulations implementation is our number one priority, and we have other pollution prevention and toxics and products laws that we are going to implement to the extent we have the resources. So, for example, the lead in jewelry, the copper and metals in brake pads, lead in plumbing. There's a variety of these laws that are still on the books, and we are going to implement to the extent we can at a lower priority. Our traditional sector-based pollution prevention work, again, is going to be done to the extent we can, along with supporting the Green Business Program in California. Realistically, there's not going to be a lot going on because we just don't have the resources. The large quantity generator, SB14 program, we did determine that we weren't going to do any activity on that in terms of doing sector-based analysis, but the large quantity hazardous waste generators are still required to go through that process.
Great. Excellent. Thank you again, Carl. If there are no more questions, let's close up this agenda item, and I'm going to hand the mic over to my co-chair, Kelly, to introduce agenda item number 7, the Green Ribbon Science Panel Program Overview.
Thank you, Art. The next item, Meredith will be walking us through basically an overview to clarify the roles and contributions of us so we can understand better the expectations, how we all work together. And so this is a particularly important area procedurally, and I do want to encourage panel members to ask their questions. We are doing a little bit of a free flow in questions here in the room in Richmond since there are 8 panelists here, and I do want to apologize to the other members. If you have a burning question, please type it into the box, and Evelia Rodriguez, who's a highly skilled staff member, is actually helping us with that procedural thing, so she will be keeping an eye on that and can read those out. But we will go through after Meredith completes her presentation and make sure that everybody has an opportunity to ask questions. So with that, Meredith.
Thank you. Corey, I would like to ask you, if you could, to put up the operating principles, the operating guidelines on screen. Could you do that? Do you have those?
I have to. It'll take me a while to get them up.
It's okay. There's no rush.
All right.
But just it'll be useful to reference those as we talk. So I want to return to what Director Rafael talked about in terms of the goals for the regulations as a whole, that they be meaningful, defensible, and practical. And I wanted to talk about what that meant in terms of the grasp. I wanted, in terms of being meaningful, it's a challenge for you. We know how busy you all are. We know what your other commitments are. And so, first of all, we want to make it worth your time in terms of being meaningful, in terms of crafting agendas, deciding what questions we need to ask you, and figuring out productive ways to engage you. So we are very, very committed to that. And we do expect your feedback on whether or not we're meeting that goal every step of the way. I know that we learned a lot with the last grasp, and the past co-chairs have not only shared some of their expertise and what they learned with me, but they passed on a lot of knowledge to our new co-chairs, and so we are counting on picking up where we left off in terms of having an effective interaction between staff and GRASP members so that the time is well used. And that will entail a lot of work, for instance, to set up the April meeting to make sure we have the materials to you in time to review them, and we have cogent questions to share with you to provide guidance. It is a different kind of science panel, and number one, because it's not just a science panel, we have a breadth of expertise. And number two, because it's not a consensus group, it's not, Kelly alluded to this, we're not going to take votes on things. It is you in a position to make recommendations, very strong recommendations, and then staff have to decide what to do with those recommendations. And that said, that's why staff need to understand how important it is to be committed to the meaningful part of implementing the regs and using your time. So in terms of the defensible part of our approach, that comes down to being a good science panel. Good science panels question the science. There is the scientific process that's very, can be very debate-oriented. Good scientists challenge assumptions, and we're counting on you to poke at our frameworks and our conceptual ideas for how we're putting things together. And we think the regulations in and of themselves are quite defensible. However, again, Director Rafael alluded to the fact that our staff does not have the breadth that you bring, and therefore we may not anticipate some of the challenges that we're going to get. And so I almost view this panel as one place where the tires get kicked on our ideas and our approaches and our documents and everything else, so that we really can make sure that they are defensible when we go out to the larger world. I mean, it's kind of like a little bit of family in terms of, you do a little bit of toughening us up within the family so that we're ready for the world. Excuse me. So I really want to ask you to take that seriously and to feel comfortable challenging staff, and then it's our job, particularly Carl and my job, to make sure the staff listens with big ears, as an advisor once told me to do, and be ready to really receive the input that you provide and incorporate it and know what to do with it and be ready to use it. So that's the commitment I want to make to you in terms of the defensible part of the work. And then there's the practical. And again, we come back to this over and over again. The regs are done. Not to say they can't be modified. They will be modified as we identify products and we develop regulatory language specific to those products. There'll be additional regulatory opportunities. We're already amending the regulations, which I don't know if we're going to talk about that a little bit.
I hadn't. I can.
We should come back to that.
Sure.
But that said, we're operating within that framework, and so we are not having abstract conversations. These things are very real, and so what that means is we need to work within those constraints and really bear those in mind. When SFEI, this institute, really talks constantly about bringing science to bear for decision making, staff are going to have to make decisions about what the regulatory response is going to be to a particular alternative assessment that's given us, or to a particular chemical in a product. And that's really very down in the weeds. But we need to make sure that staff has criteria and frameworks and approaches that really enables them to make those decisions consistently, transparent, with some transparency, so that the responsible entities really understand what's being asked of them and why the decisions are being made. And I really think that you have a lot to offer in terms of making sure that we do those things. So those are some of the overarching principles we are committed to, just in terms of working with you. Were you going to walk through the guidelines? Okay. So, Corey, did you have any luck bringing up the guidelines? Because if you didn't, we could pull them off the website and get those up.
Meredith, this is Jeff, and we're having trouble at this end.
Okay. Okay. We're going to take a second and bring them up. Unless... Pardon? They were posted. Is that correct, Corey? They were posted?
Meredith, we all had them in the material that was sent to us as GRSP members. This is Bill Carroll.
Okay. So why don't we work? Does everybody in the room have their copy of the guidelines? Only I don't have it. Actually, I could have pulled it up on my computer. That would be. So we just want to talk about these operational guidelines. These were formally called the terms of reference, and because there's no actual legal framework for these guidelines in terms of the regulations, we kind of wanted to move away from that language. So hopefully that title is acceptable to all of you. And I just want to walk through these very straightforward. You are the Green Ribbon Science Panel as called for in Section 25.2.25.4 of the Health and Safety Code. And the purpose, which I'm hoping there'll be some discussion around, is really about advising us on technical and scientific issues related to the program. Again, this idea of informing our decision-making is very critical, using sound science within these practical considerations. So all of the things I just said hopefully are reflected in this purpose. We know you bring a breadth of expertise, plastic science, electronics, adhesives, occupational health, toxicology, emerging contaminants and chemicals. The list goes on, and we are counting on using that expertise because the breadth of consumer products is so overwhelming, quite frankly. So we are going to work within the guidelines, and I think that's just the general purpose. Does anybody have any questions, challenges, discomfort with the purpose as stated? Okay. I'm going to talk about the membership. Again, I just alluded to this breadth of expertise that we've included on the panel and panel members, and those are called out explicitly in the statute. In the statute or in the regs? They're in the statute. Mm-hmm. And we're committed to making sure we have that expertise available. This is a smaller panel than we had in the past. We think that'll make it a little leaner and meaner in terms of input and decision-making and advising, but we still expect to have that breadth. Ultimately, the panel is convened by the director of DTSC and will be appointed by the director. And given any circumstances, the director may decide to reconfigure the panel, and also you're free to resign should the need arise. Again, Kelly, on the issue of representation, Kelly talked a bit about the importance of, it's a delicate balance. We asked you here because you come from a particular sector, you have a particular area of expertise. At the same time, we're asking you not to speak as the advocate for that particular sector, but to think in terms of being a larger, more independent panel member. So that is a very important guiding principle for us. And then we do not have means to let you delegate somebody to represent you if you're not able to attend. You're all already giving us financial interest reports. We have the budget to reimburse you. And then the rest of these things, I think, have largely been covered in terms of we have able co-chairs. In this case, we're assigned from the director, but in the future will be in partnership between the deputy director and the director. And staff is available to meet your needs and make the meetings beneficial and effective for you, and we count on you to let us know whether or not we're meeting that goal. We talked already about open meetings, teleconferences. The quorum, again, would be 8. Notice is very important, and everything else in this section is really very largely related to Bagley-Keene. In the past, one of the things that was very effective for the group was to work through subcommittees, and we do expect to do that. We have provisions for doing that. It is very unlikely that a subcommittee will constitute a quorum, so we think that subcommittees can do their work within the framework of Bagley-Keene and then report out to the larger group at larger meetings when everybody's in attendance. And then, again, I've already talked about the fact that this is a very public forum. I think you're going to be very self-aware, but understand that at any time the public can ask us, make a public records request, and ask for documentation of all the work of this panel. So, I think the last thing the last couple things on here, if you get questions, we would appreciate either you referring them to DTSC directly or being very clear in your response to any media that you are speaking on your own behalf and not on behalf of the full GRAS. And last but not least, as we go along, we may decide that these guidelines aren't adequate for everything we need, and we'll need to modify them in some way, shape, or form. If you have suggestions for that, they can come directly to the department. They can come through your co-chairs. We are working very closely together. There was a lot of collaborative prep for this meeting, and we anticipate that. So a lot of times to this morning when I've heard communicate with Corey, I have wanted to add parenthetically, or your co-chairs. So feel free to use whatever means of communication you're most comfortable with. Questions, comments, suggestions?
All right, we'll start here in Richmond and cycle through the locations. And I do, before we go into questions and comments, I do want to reemphasize Art's and my commitment to working with DTSC and the staff to make all of this work well, to make really good use of your time, and to make this a good process. If at any time you have concerns, as Meredith is, the department's more than willing to speak with you, but so are we. And I'm also looking for suggestions. Ken Geiser and Bill Carroll have both already told me that they will be more than free to provide their advice, and I very much appreciate that commitment, both in terms of how Art and I run the meeting and things we can do to facilitate the best process from our end. And Meredith has already offered, taken exactly that same statement to Art and me, that they're really looking forward to working with us. So I just really want to reemphasize that point, that this is a teamwork process to do the best we can for the state. So starting here in Richmond, I see Mike has his card up, and maybe we'll get a mic over to him.
Mike Carangello, and it's a clarifying question just on my part, and it goes back to the quorum issue. When we talk quorum, we don't count DTSC staff as part of that. So if we're having a subcommittee meeting and there's 4 of us on the subcommittee and 4 DTSC staff members, okay, I'm seeing nodding, so we don't. And Meredith, are you just at DTSC, or are you, because there's formal roles for you on GRASP as well, would we count you as part of the quorum?
No.
Okay.
I understand. That's news to me if I were, but no.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And to follow up on that, for anyone outside this group, it's important that, although we didn't talk about it, the procedures in front of us specify that any subcommittee doesn't report directly to DTSC. There may be meetings with DTSC staff, but everything that happens in the subcommittee is reported out to the full committee, and there can be further discussion at the full committee level. So that's to make sure that all of this process is a public process, even though there may be a small group discussion offline. It's going to come back partly to be public, but also partly because those folks who are not on the subcommittee may also have some specific additional things to provide in our overall advice to DTSC. So I'm not seeing any other flags in Richmond. We'll start down the sites and see if Tim Malloy has any questions or comments, if he can put it on. And not seeing anything, I'll leave him to type a message if he'd like to say anything, and move on to Washington and Ken.
No comments.
Okay, Ohio, Don?
No comments.
Okay. Texas, Bill?
No comments, thank you.
Okay, Massachusetts, Ken? And I'm not hearing anything from Ken, so I'm assuming that means none. And again,
sorry, no comments.
Okay. And Washington, Cal?
I just have a clarifying question. So I'm just a little confused about the flow of information. So if I want to provide a report or data or information to the panel for consideration, who do I send that to?
Well, I would recommend at this stage that the information go to Corey, number one, so that she can consolidate things, and then I would also suggest copying you and Art for the time being.
Yeah, as long as it hasn't gone to anyone else. If it's already been around the panel at all, best to send it to Corey, and then the staff can tell us we have something and move it forward.
Great, okay. Thank you, that's helpful.
And the Bagley-Keene Act does allow us to post things after the fact, after a meeting, so there may be occasions where we are posting after you've received the information.
So does that answer your question, Cal?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. So one last chance here in Richmond. I see no flags. And anyone on the phone? I see Tim Malloy doesn't have any comments. All right. So I think that concludes this item. And we are to the point of our break. And we'll be taking a break. For those of the West, it's a lunch break. And for everyone else, please enjoy your 40 minutes. And we'll be reconvening at 12:40 to stick with the times on the agenda. So please put yourself on hold or disconnect at your choice, but please be reconnected and ready to proceed at 12:40 Pacific time. Thank you.
Let me call the second half of our webinar back in session. And we're on agenda item number 8. Safer Consumer Products Regulations, and Lynn Goldman, staff attorney at DTSC, will provide information on the requirements of the Safer Consumer Products Regulations for panel discussion. Lynn, are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent.
Okay, so as Art just told you, my name is Lynn Goldman, and I'm a staff attorney here at DTSC. Today I'm going to go through the Safer Consumer Products Regulations in order to provide you with a larger context in which your advice will be used.
Excuse me, Lynn?
Yes.
Could you get a little closer to the mic, please?
Sure, is that better?
That's better, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, a little technical difficulties. Bear with us here. Okay. So the regulations were enacted to provide a comprehensive solution to address toxins in products, along with the ability to avoid regrettable substitutes. Before these regulations, toxins in products have been regulated on a case-by-case basis with single chemical bans. And most of you are probably familiar with some of these bans. AB 1108 dealt with phthalates in toys, and it prohibits the manufacture, sale, or distribution of certain toys and child care articles if those products contain phthalates in concentrations higher than 0.1%. AB 1319 banned BPA from baby bottles and sippy cups that were made or sold after July 1st, 2013. The issue with these types of solutions comes down to a substitution problem. BPA is a great example. Industry responded by creating BPA-free products, which you probably see in the store all the time. However, these BPA-free products are made from a plastic containing a compound called BPS, which is bisphenol S. In addition to having very similar names, BPA and BPS share a similar structure and versatility. So now, BPS is known to be used in everything from currency to thermal receipt paper, and widespread human exposure has been confirmed through analysis of urine samples taken in the U.S., Canada, China, and 5 other Asian countries. So clearly banning a chemical can't always solve the problem, and it has the potential to make it worse. That's why our regulations are moving us away from the question of is it safe to have this particular chemical in a product, or is it legal to have this chemical, to a question which allows manufacturers to reconsider the way they're making their products. So the Safer Consumer Products Regulations will require manufacturers to ask, is it necessary to have this chemical in my product? How will this work? I'm going to go through the whole process step by step, but first let's take a look at the process as a whole. We've started by identifying a list of nearly 1,200 chemicals. The candidate chemicals list provides the menu from which we can choose to regulate. Then we'll start by looking at products that contain one or more of the chemicals on this list, where there's information showing that the products can lead the consumer to be exposed to that chemical. We're working now to prioritize among these products to come up with our initial list of up to 5 priority products. Once the products are formally identified through a rulemaking process, manufacturers will be required to notify DTSC that they make the product and complete an alternatives analysis. Once the manufacturer completes this process, they will select an alternative. DTSC will evaluate their selection and impose an appropriate regulatory response where necessary. The response can range from nothing, where DTSC finds that the selected alternative has sufficiently reduced the harm presented by the product, to a phase out of the sale of that product in California because no safe alternative to the product exists. So let's go through this step by step. First, we're looking at the candidate chemicals identification. We started by looking at chemicals lists that were created by a variety of authoritative bodies. These lists group chemicals based on their hazard traits and their potential for exposure. The list was posted to our website on September 26th of last year, and anyone can go through there and search for chemicals and get information related to the chemical's potential for adverse impacts and exposures, along with what authoritative body list the chemical appears on. So why did we choose to use a list of lists approach? Well, first of all, we wanted to make sure that we had an inclusive list in order to avoid regrettable substitutions. Manufacturers cannot replace the chemical of concern in their product with a candidate chemical, with one small exception that I will discuss later on. Also, the list is serving as a signal to the marketplace. Manufacturers can get ahead of our program by looking at the list now and identifying whether or not they are using any of these chemicals to make their products. If they don't want to fall under the regulations, they can start the process now of removing those chemicals from their products before we ever get around to naming their product. So like I said, the initial list is about 1,200 chemicals, and the 2 types of lists that we're using fall into 2 broad categories. First, we have lists that identify hazard traits associated with chemicals, and second, we have lists that show known chemical exposures. Hazard trait lists are looking at things like reproductive toxins, carcinogens, and respiratory sensitizers. Exposures lists are showing the presence of the chemicals in humans from biomonitoring studies or the air or water. For the first round of priority products, we're only looking at chemicals that appear on both a hazard trait and an exposure list. So this middle area, the group of overlap, is about 150 chemicals. From there, the next step in the process is to identify our priority products. Once we have officially selected the products containing a candidate chemical for regulation, the chemical will be called a chemical of concern for that priority product. So what are we looking at in order to select these priority products? The priority product must have a potential exposure to the candidate chemical in the product, and there must be the potential for this exposure to contribute to or cause significant or widespread adverse impacts. So we've started looking at adverse impacts from candidate chemicals. Then we're looking at the populations for which the candidate chemical has the potential to contribute to or cause those adverse impacts. We are paying close attention to adverse impacts to sensitive subpopulations, environmentally sensitive habitats, and endangered or threatened species. We are also evaluating the potential for exposure to the candidate chemical from the product. This involves looking at the market presence of the product, the potential for exposure from use of the product, the household or workplace presence of the product, and all potential exposures to the candidate chemical throughout the product's life cycle. In addition, we are considering the extent and quality of available information that supports the existence of these impacts and exposures, along with other regulatory programs that might apply to the chemical or the product, and the existence of readily available safer alternatives. So once we've selected our proposed priority products, what will happen next? Each priority product will need to be formally established through the Administrative Procedure Act's rulemaking process, and that's the APA. I'll be saying that a lot. And before we get there, DTSC will be holding at least one public workshop to discuss the proposed priority products. As we've mentioned earlier, the list of proposed priority products will be announced no later than April 1st of this year. The formal rulemaking process will begin within the next year and will be completed within 1 year from the date that DTSC publishes the official notice of proposed regulatory action. So bear with me as we go through the rulemaking process. It's a lot to take in, but I think it's important to understand. So I'm going to try and point on this slide because I know that there's a lot going on, and this is a graphic that was prepared by the Office of Administrative Law. So first, DTSC will need to prepare the documents required to conduct a formal APA rulemaking proceeding. During the preliminary activity stage, DTSC will prepare the proposed text of the regulations, the initial statement of reasons, the 399 fiscal impact statement, and the notice of a proposed rulemaking. To initiate the rulemaking action, an agency issues a notice by having it published in the California Regulatory Notice Register. We mail the notice to persons who have requested notification, and we post the text, the notice, the initial statement of reasons, all on the agency's website. So once we publish the notice, that's where we are here, the rulemaking record is open, and the APA rulemaking process has officially started. At that point, we have 1 year with which to complete the rulemaking and submit the file to OAL. The APA requires a minimum of 45 days for the public to comment in writing on the proposed regulation. Under the APA, an agency can decide whether or not it's going to have a public hearing, but if we don't schedule a public hearing, any interested person can submit a written request for one to be held. After the initial public comment period, DTSC will consider all of the comments. So that's where we are here. If we decide to make any change to our initial proposal, we need to decide whether or not the change is first non-substantial, substantial and sufficiently related, or substantial and not sufficiently related. If the change is non-substantial, then we don't have to go back out for another notice and comment period. If the comment is substantial and sufficiently related, which is probably what the change would be, we would go out for a 15-day comment period, and so we send notice back to everyone who we've already given notice to and anyone who submitted comments, and then they can comment on whatever changes that we've made. If we made any major changes, which for these rulemaking packages would mean probably that we're changing which priority product we're going after, we would have to go back up. So we have major changes, go back up, publish notice, and start over again. Once we have all of the comments, and we can do that 15-day comment period as many times as we need to get the regulations right. But once we have all of the comments and we're not going to change the regulations anymore, we are required to respond on the record to all the comments that we received and explain either how we've amended our proposal to accommodate the comment or explain why we're not making any changes to our proposal. The summary in response to comments is included as part of the rulemaking file in a document called the Final Statement of Reasons. So that's over here. As I mentioned, DTSC must transmit the complete rulemaking file to the Office of Administrative Law for review within 1 year from the date that the notice was published in the California Register. So then OAL will review our package. They have 30 days to conduct this review, and they review the rulemaking record to determine whether it demonstrates that the agency has satisfied the procedural requirements of the APA, and to review the regulations for compliance with the 6 legal standards that are set forth in the APA, which are authority, reference, consistency, clarity, non-duplication, and necessity. The Office of Administrative Law does not substitute its judgment for ours, so they're really just looking at whether or not we complied with the APA and not the substantive content of the regulations. That covers the rulemaking process with the Office of Administrative Law, but there are a couple of other things that we're going to need to do for our rulemaking. The California Health and Safety Code, Section 57004, requires external scientific peer review for the scientific portion of any proposed rule. So agencies enter into agreements with a scientist or a group of scientists in order to determine whether the scientific portion of the proposed rule is based upon sound scientific knowledge, methods, and practice. Additionally, DTSC's adoption of regulations is a project subject to the rules of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and DTSC will comply with the requirements of CEQA in adopting these regulations. Lastly, AB 1879 requires DTSC to consult with the California Environmental Policy Council. The council consists of the Secretary for Environmental Protection, the Director of Pesticide Regulation, the Director of our agency, the Chairman of the State Air Resources Control Board, the Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board, the Director of the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and the Director of the Department of Resources Recycling and Recovery. the Council consultation will look at whether the regulations have any significant adverse impact on public health or the environment. So once the priority products are identified through the rulemaking process, how do manufacturers answer this question of is it necessary? This will occur through the alternatives analysis process. So first I want to just look at who will be complying with these regulations. The regulations apply to all consumer products that are placed into the stream of commerce in California. And just a note on that, consumer products by definition do not include prescription drugs, dental restorative materials, medical devices, food, the packaging associated with prescription drugs, dental restorative materials, or medical devices, and pesticides. So all of those are out of the purview of our program. The regulations were designed to work with product manufacturers, so the responsibility for compliance falls first to those manufacturers. So these are who makes the product, who controls the manufacturing process, or who has the capacity to specify which chemicals are in the product. If a manufacturer fails to comply with the program, responsibility falls to the importer of the product who brings it into California, and if they don't comply, then it's up to retailers or assemblers. All of these entities may opt out of the regulations by ceasing to order the priority product from the manufacturer. So I'm going to go through the AA process in a lot more detail, but this is going to give you some context in terms of timing. Once a priority product is finalized, i.e. the rule naming the product becomes effective, manufacturers have 60 days to notify DTSC that they make the priority product. At that time, a manufacturer can also submit one of 4 notifications to DTSC that will effectively remove them from the regulatory process. An AA is not required if a manufacturer submits one of these by the due date of the preliminary AA report or by the due date of their final AA report if they already submitted a preliminary AA. So the first is a chemical removal intent notification, which certifies that the chemical of concern will be removed from their product without the use of any replacement chemical. Second, we have a product removal intent notification that certifies that the manufacturer will cease to fulfill orders for the product from persons selling or distributing that priority product in California. Third, we have a product chemical replacement intent notification, which certifies that the chemical of concern will be removed from the product and that any replacement chemical meets one of the following criteria. The replacement chemical is not on the list of candidate chemicals, or the replacement chemical is a candidate chemical that is already in use in lieu of the chemical of concern to manufacture the same product by the same or a different manufacturer. So an intent notification must be followed by a submission of a confirmation notification within 90 days or by the due date of the preliminary AA report, whichever is later. So they're going to have to send us a certification that says that we told you we were going to remove these things and we actually have done that. The last notification that can get them out of the AA process is the alternatives analysis threshold notification. So this is a new concept from the last time that the Green Ribbon Science Panel met, so I just wanted to go over this in a little bit of detail, and for those of you who are new to this process. So a manufacturer may submit an AAT exemption notification for its priority product if the chemical of concern is present in their product solely as a contaminant and the concentration of the chemical of concern does not exceed the practical quantitation limit for that chemical. DTSC also has the ability to specify in their proposed priority product that an alternatives analysis threshold concentration greater than the PQL for a chemical of concern that is a contaminant in a product. Also, DTSC could set an AAT for a chemical of concern that is an intentionally added ingredient, and that would be all specified in the rulemaking for that priority product. So now that we've covered these different notifications that would get responsible entities out of completing the alternatives analysis process, let's look at how that will play out for manufacturers who are actually going to move forward and complete an alternatives analysis. AB 1879 gave us the criteria for the analysis. You can see that this list is thorough and encompasses an analysis of the full life cycle of the product. Manufacturers will be required to look at things like the useful life of their product and their alternatives, water conservation for both the product and the alternatives, energy efficiency, waste and end-of-life considerations, all of this, their product and their proposed alternatives. The first stage of the alternatives analysis starts with the identification of the product requirements and the functions of the chemical of concern in the product. So the manufacturer has to look at the function, performance, and legal requirements that are associated with their priority product that must be met by all of their alternatives. The function of the chemical of concern in meeting the priority product's function, performance, and legal requirements is also something that the manufacturer will identify. Next, the manufacturer will determine whether or not the chemical of concern or an alternative replacement chemical is necessary to meet the priority product's function, performance, and legal requirements. If they determine that neither the chemical of concern or an alternative replacement chemical is necessary to meet those requirements, then the removal of the chemical of concern from the priority product without the addition of any chemical will have to be evaluated as one of the alternatives to the priority product. So the next step is to identify alternatives to the product. And this means that manufacturers are going to identify alternatives that meet the requirements for their priority product while eliminating or reducing the concentration of the chemical of concern in their product, or reducing or restricting public health or environmental exposures to the chemical of concern in their product. The responsible entity is required to include in the AA consideration of any identified existing viable alternatives. In the next step, the manufacturer will identify factors that are relevant for their comparison of alternatives. So a factor in conjunction with an associated exposure pathway and life cycle segment is relevant if it makes a material contribution to the adverse public health impacts, adverse environmental impacts, adverse waste and end-of-life impacts, and or materials and resource consumption impacts associated with the priority product, and one or more alternatives under consideration. And there is a material difference in the factor's contribution to such impacts between the priority product and one or more of the alternatives being considered, or between two or more of the alternatives. The identification of relevant exposure pathways must consider chemical quantity information and exposure factors. The second part of that process will be to evaluate and screen alternative replacement chemicals. The responsible entity is required to use available information and analytical tools to evaluate and compare each of their alternative replacement chemicals under consideration with the chemical of concern in the priority product with respect to the relevant factors that they've identified already in this step. At this point, the responsible entity may eliminate any alternative replacement chemical that it determines has the potential to pose equal or greater adverse public health or environmental impacts as compared to the chemical of concern from further consideration in the AA process. So if they can tell right there that the alternative would be worse, they don't have to continue to evaluate that alternative. So then step 4, the responsible entity is required to prepare and include in the preliminary AA report a work plan and proposed implementation schedule for completion of the second stage of the AA and the preparation and submittal of their final AA report. Once DTSC receives a preliminary AA report, within 60 days we will issue a notice of compliance, a notice of deficiency, a notice of disapproval, or a notice of ongoing review. The notice of compliance will contain the due date for the final AA report, which in most cases is going to be 12 months from the date of the notice of compliance. So now the second stage of the alternative analysis. First, in IDing relevant comparison factors, the responsible entity may use available information and analytical tools to reevaluate their identification of the factors from the first step of the AA, and they can see whether or not that those are still the relevant factors that they should be considering between their alternatives, or if they need to add more or take any out based on new information. So essentially we're just making sure that what they've decided were the relevant factors in the first stage are still what need to be evaluated in the second stage. In step 2, the comparison of the priority product and alternatives, this is where the responsible entity is actually doing the comparison of their alternatives. They must use available quantitative information and analytical tools supplemented by available qualitative information and analytical tools to evaluate and compare the priority product and each alternative with respect to each relevant factor that was previously identified. And in step 3, the alternative selection decision, the responsible entity will select the alternative that will replace their priority product or decide to retain the priority product as is, and then they will prepare and submit a final AA report to DTSC. So how will DTSC involve the public in this AA review process? First, all of our final AA reports will be posted, allowing for redaction of trade secrets, and the public will be able to comment on these final AA reports. And DTSC will review the comments that are submitted by the public to determine which warrant a response from the manufacturer. So then we're going to send those comments to the manufacturer and make them address them. In DTSC's review of a final AA report, we're going to be looking at whether the AA report was submitted timely, whether and to what extent the responsible entity considered and addressed all of the applicable provisions of the articles in our regulations, and whether to what extent the responsible entity demonstrated that the conclusions of the AA were based on reliable information when applicable. So this slide provides a snapshot of the timing for the AA process. So the priority product notification is due 60 days after the final priority product listing through the APA, and then a preliminary AA report is due 180 days after that final listing as a priority product. DTSC will review the preliminary AA and issue a notice of compliance within 60 days after receiving the preliminary AA report. And then the final AA report will be due to DTSC 12 months after that notice of compliance. We will review the final AA and issue a notice of compliance within 60 days after receiving that report. And of course, it might not be a notice of compliance. It could be one of these other notices, but eventually we're getting towards notice of compliance. So we just discussed a standard two-stage alternatives analysis. Responsible entities may choose to comply with the AA in a different way. So first, there's an abridged AA report. If after completion of the steps leading up to a preliminary AA, a responsible entity determines that a functionally acceptable and technically feasible alternative is not available, they can prepare and submit an abridged AA report in lieu of a preliminary and final AA. And that means that they're going to go straight to the regulatory response stage. They're just saying that, we can't change our product. What do you think we should do? An alternative process AA is where a responsible entity wants to use a process different from the one that we describe in the regulations, and their process will need to provide the information needed to prepare an AA report that substantially meets the AA report requirements that are specified in the regulations, and the alternative process will need to compare the priority product and the alternatives using, at a minimum, the same factors and associated exposure pathways and life cycle segments that would be used as if they followed our AA process. And they submit an alternative process AA work plan to DTSC no later than the due date for the priority product notification. So really, the responsible entity would have likely made this decision to use an alternative process AA at some point during the rulemaking phase, because they will have to have the work plan ready for us within 60 days after the rule becomes effective. Also, responsible entities will be allowed to fulfill the AA requirements by submitting a report for a previously completed AA for the priority product if we determine that the report is substantially equivalent to the AA requirements specified in the regulations, and that the report contains sufficient information to identify regulatory responses. If at any point before submitting a final AA, a responsible entity removes or reduces the concentration of one or more replacement candidate chemicals, they must still evaluate both the original priority product and their reformulated product so that we are making sure we're avoiding regrettable substitution. Lastly, after a final AA report is submitted, a responsible entity may change their alternative selection, but they're required to submit a revised final AA report with an explanation of the change. And that report would also be required if their original selection was to keep the priority product and they decided to go with an alternative. So before I move on to talking about the regulatory responses, I wanted to briefly address just terminology. As we've discussed, our regulations contain a very specific process that we're calling the alternatives analysis. There are other programs out there with similar goals that often are called alternatives assessment. Our alternatives analysis is specific to the regulations, and the process and terminology comes straight out of AB 1879, which is our authorizing legislation. So we're not saying that the other processes are better or worse than our own, but to the extent that they differ from what we're doing, this is what we have, and it's really based on fulfilling the mandate of the authorizing legislation. So let's move on and discuss what can happen after DTSC has a final approved AA report, the regulatory response. Within 90 days after issuing a notice of compliance or a notice of disapproval for a final AA report, DTSC will issue a notice of its proposed determination that one or more of the regulatory responses that I will discuss briefly are required, or that no regulatory response is required. So what are these regulatory responses? AB 1879 gave us 8 potential regulatory responses to take following the completion of the alternatives analysis. And although we weren't limited to those 8, we felt that they were a sufficient suite of options to choose from and didn't add any additional regulatory responses. The regulations specify that the responses will apply to products that are manufactured as a selected alternative following the completion of an AA, priority products for which an alternative is not selected, priority products that will remain in commerce pending the development and distribution of the selected alternative, and any alternatives that are disapproved by DTSC. So a proposed regulatory response determination will be sent to all known affected responsible entities and made available for public review and comment for a minimum of 45 days. After consideration of public comments, DTSC will send a final regulatory response determination notice to all known responsible entities and post the final notice on its website. The notice will include the due date for implementing the regulatory response, and in assigning this implementation due date, DTSC will consider the complexity of implementing the regulatory response so that it's reasonable that the responsible entity has time to implement it. So what will success look like for this program? First is a signal to the marketplace, and we think that we're already seeing this. Manufacturers who make products that contain candidate chemicals, and manufacturers who make products that don't contain candidate chemicals are making themselves known and say, hey, I know that a lot of people in our industry make these products with candidate chemicals. I'm making something without it. You should probably consider getting on board before DTSC names your product. Next, we think this is an opportunity for innovation. Manufacturers can reformulate their products and market themselves as innovators in their industry and reap the benefits of that. Also, just one more thing for those of you who are on the last Green Ribbon Science panel. I've noted one important change to the regulations, which was that alternatives analysis threshold. Also, we've eliminated the Certified Assessors Program. So now we allow responsible entities to conduct these alternatives analysis without third-party verification before our review. We think that the added cost to industry and DTSC, coupled with the potential for dragging out and delaying the assessment of products, really led us to the determination that we should eliminate the Certified Assessors Program. And we think that with the public review and DTSC's review of alternatives analysis, we will be getting good reports that include stakeholder input, and we'll have good content in these alternatives analysis. So that's the end of my presentation, and we can take questions now.
Great. Thank you very much, Lynn, for walking us through the fundamentals of the Safer Consumer Products regulations. So let me now open up the question-answer period. And let me again ask the panel members to please identify yourself when you're making a comment or asking a question. And again, we'll go through starting with the physical location here in Richmond and then rotate through the various remote locations. So I see some flags up already. Let's start with Mike.
This is Mike Carangello. Regarding the initial list of priority products, the specified is that there are going to be 5 to start with maximum. Does that mean when you propose the initial list that it could be more than 5 you propose to get feedback on those and then cut it down to 5, or even in that initial list will be 5 maximum?
The initial list will be up to 5. It will be no more than 5.
Okay, thank you.
Julia?
It's Julia Clint. I understand that you eliminated the certified assessors. Will you be listing what you think are the, not qualifications, but the level of expertise needed to do one of these alternatives assessments? A number of the frameworks, DFE and I think REACH also, they say that, certain expertise is required, or they talk about expertise required. And I think it's somewhat helpful because some of the information that people need to gather and evaluate is fairly complex. So I was just wondering if you would have that in the guidance. I don't think it's in the regulation currently.
Defer to Carl.
Well, this is Carl, or Lynn can chime in. The guidance will not include any additional regulatory requirements.
Right, can't.
So it's likely that we could, highlight that for certain tasks, these kinds of skill sets are
right.
Helpful or
right.
when you start looking at weighing the adequacy, we will probably provide ways to evaluate that, but we can't, in the guidance, put in a new requirement saying that someone has to have this certification or qualification.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean certification, but just, it's
I don't know if Lynn
sort of to speak broadly about expertise, because I think we've had situations like with the Hazard Communication Standard where the expertise has been quite variable, and what you get out at the other end reflects that. So it's...
There's not, I think that's good information to include in the guidance.
Yeah, in the guidance.
Captured that.
Right.
But we'll take it back. That's very good input.
Okay, thank you.
Next is Kelly.
I have two questions, Lynn. The first one is that earlier in the meeting, there was a brief mention about amending the regulations, and I just wanted to know if there was any information that you could share about those thoughts.
Carl, you should answer that.
Well, yeah, so this is Carl. Yes, in the regulations that were adopted, there was what I would call a typo, but essentially there was an error in Section 502, Standard 502 of the regulations where we identified which authoritative lists we were pulling from. And the two lists were related to the EU lists for endocrine disruptors and PBTs. And so while our supporting documents and intent and dialogue was all on point, we pointed to a list that doesn't actually exist. So we're in the process, and Avelia Rodriguez here is our point person for this, for crafting new language, and we'll be putting together a complete rulemaking package to fix that error, if you will. The net effect of that was that some of the chemicals that would have been on our list are not there and won't be there until we make that change.
Thank you.
Time frame for that change within the next few months. You should be seeing a public notice. So when you see that, the scope of that rulemaking is really those two provisions that are found in Section 69502.2.
Just to stay on that point, this is Julia Clint. I just wanted to be clear to understand what the change is. So you had the list that you had were not the correct list, but you're still endocrine toxicity is still an endpoint.
We used language that pointed to that was incorrect. We got comment from the EU giving us language, and there was a mix-up, and somehow we got the wrong list. So all the dialogue was about the right list, and so with the change will reflect as we will correct the language to point to it, and then we'll be pointing back to the dialogue and that we already had on why we want this list, and the rationale is still the same. So in that sense, it's like a typo, and so hopefully we'll be able to move this package along pretty quickly because we've already addressed in both comments previously most of the issues. Now, we will be opening up the record again, so people are welcome to comment again on these things, but from our perspective, nothing has changed.
This is Kelly again, and the second question I have is that Lynn, you mentioned the scientific peer review process that's mandated for Cal EPA regulations. Would members of the Green Ribbon Science Panel potentially be tapped to do those types of scientific peer reviews, or would we not be considered to be independent enough to be doing those scientific peer reviews? Maybe Lynn's on mute.
I can answer that question.
Oh, okay.
We typically go through Cal EPA's process of assigning a peer review process, which goes through that's sort of blind to us in terms of who gets selected, and it's based on their professional experience and qualifications. And we also have the latitude to go out and do additional quote-unquote peer review to get additional input. Is theoretically
use who we want, as long as they, again, met the criteria that would be relevant to what we were asking to be peer reviewed. So I don't think we're precluded from that, although I don't know that it would be. We'd have to talk to our legal counsel to see if that would be legal or not.
But I guess the gist of my question was, is that a function of this group? And the answer is no.
No.
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
Good. Anne?
Thank you, Art. This question is for Lynn. Lynn, I may be jumping the gun a little bit, but you mentioned the possibility of an alternative AA that would go through an evaluation for being substantially equivalent. How well is that piece of what is substantially equivalent been developed, or is that something that's going to be developed in the next year or so?
So that would really be on a case-by-case basis. If they submit an alternative process AA work plan to evaluate whether or not it's going to essentially meet the requirements of our AA, and so that would be on a case-by-case basis.
So those criteria will be driven by the text of the regulation, basically?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Are there any more questions here in Richmond? I don't see any, so let me rotate through the remote locations, starting with location number 3 in Los Angeles. Tim?
So Tim has actually submitted a question in writing. I will read it now. He says, if after completing an AA, a manufacturer notifies DTSC that it is selecting an alternative and no longer manufacturing the original product, how will that selection be enforced? So, for example, would the manufacturer be subject to any regulatory response that prohibits the sale of the original product? How would the manufacturer's implementation of the substitution be monitored going forward? So if I understand the question correctly, you're saying that they prepared a final AA report in which they have selected an alternative to their product, and at that point, DTSC will evaluate the final AA report and decide if we're accepting that. And even if they've proposed an alternative, we can still issue a regulatory response depending on what their selection is. So this is kind of built into that process. If we still think that there are issues with the alternative that they've selected, we might require them to put a label on the product to inform consumers of, exposures to chemicals in their product, or we might say that the alternative is safe and it's good to go. They don't have to do anything. There will be no regulatory response. But that will depend on which alternative they select. I'm not sure if that answers Tim's question. He's saying the question goes to how do you ensure that they do what they say they're doing, assuming that we believe it to be safe. So we will be getting more. They're going to have to ensure compliance. So I'm not. There's auditing provisions and there's enforcement provisions. I can't think of the name of the exact thing that I'm thinking of here. But in Article 8, we discuss how we will be auditing responsible entities to make sure that they're complying with the regulations, and that will be part of that.
No, I was just going to say, ultimately it may mean that we go out and purchase products and sample them to see if what's in the product is what the AA said.
I see a follow-up question from Tim. Is that correct?
Yes. So Tim says, my question is what exactly would DTSC be enforcing if there's no regulatory response? So if they've selected an alternative that we feel is acceptable, what we would be enforcing is making sure that they're actually selling that alternative and not the priority product.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's go to location 4, Washington. Ken?
Yes, this is Ken Zarker. Thanks for the opportunity. I'll throw out my first sort of rookie question here as a new member of the panel. Could you speak to the adequacy review? Some experience with reviewing things like pollution prevention plans, the criteria within those, for an internal review by an agency, determining, the adequacy to meet those, conditions. And sometimes there's a little bit of a gray area there in terms of it's, cut and dry. And I'm just curious how DTC has thought about doing adequacy reviews and some thinking on that.
Well, I think this is Carl again. I think that's one of the things that we have not yet figured out exactly, and so I think as we go through the guidance development, that concurrently we'll be looking at what that means in terms of what the product looks like and how we evaluate those products, and do things like weigh reliable information and assess data gaps and things like that, along with the criteria and the regs relative to selecting relevant criteria, et cetera. So it's a very good point. It's well taken, and we look forward to input from the GRAS on that.
Yeah, quite clearly, we actually think this is one of those possible areas where the GRAS would have a lot to say.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Location 5, Ohio, Don.
Don might be on mute.
Don, are you on mute, or you? Here we go. Okay. Since we do not have a connection there, so let's rotate to location number 6 in Texas. Bill?
Thanks, Art. And I just have a comment. Having been at this at least for some time, I think this is the clearest, most straightforward presentation that's been made on the flow of the regulations that we've seen. And I just want to make sure that the slides would be available in some public way, either on the website or provided to us individually. And perhaps whether the associated verbiage was recorded either as text or as recording the webinar.
We will be posting this to our website, and it was recorded as audio.
Very good. Thanks, Lynn.
Yep.
Excellent. Location 7, Massachusetts. Ken?
Yeah, thank you. And Lynn, thank you for a good presentation. My comment is going to follow a bit on what Ken Zarker already started, but let me just say your presentation, Lynn, sort of at one point made a big transition between sort of a very good description of how the AA process would be, how an alternative assessment and first stage and second stage would be done, but then sort of jumped immediately to regulatory response. And when I looked at the timeline, the very pretty timeline that we haven't yet talked about but got put out, I noticed that in the alternative assessment box, over half of the box is devoted to how you would review and evaluate and what happens when the reviews, what happens when something's isn't acceptable and it goes back, and lots of things like that. There seems to be a whole process there. And given that there is not going to be some kind of certified assessor, all of the weight of validation is going to be pretty much on the department and whatever process that is there. And so I guess I just encourage that the way you do this presentation include more on how you're thinking about the actual assessment of how the department's thinking about the assessment, or whether the public comment period and other such things are going to deal with that. And I also would encourage, as I think it got mentioned, that this might be a really good place for the GRAS to have some input and provide some help and support. So I guess those are just some comments about that same topic.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. Let me go to location 8 and come back to location 5 in Ohio. Then I see additional questions here in Richmond. So location 8, Washington, D.C. Cal?
Yes, thank you. This is Cal Bayer Anderson, and I would just like some clarification on the scope of our advice. I think I had been assuming that we would focus that our panel would focus on the alternatives analysis component and perhaps the regulatory response. But I was wondering if there were also opportunities to comment on the upstream events, such as the selection of chemicals of concern and the product-chemical combinations, or is that outside of our scope?
No, this is Meredith, and there is room for the GRAS to weigh in on those things. We expect, for instance, given that we'll be announcing the products before April, that by the time we reconvene, we will have made that announcement, and it might be worth some time on the agenda to do a debrief, to collect some of your observations, concerns, clarify questions, and get some input on that process. We are learning a lot in what it takes to designate a product, and we may come back to you and say, did we use the right criteria? What other things should we be considering? So that would be very appropriate for the GRAS to weigh in on. Similarly, as we know you may have the ability to stay on top of emerging science better than we do in some areas, and that may mean that you are aware of developments regarding candidate chemicals, new lists that emerge, other things that happen in the science, and it would be great to get that brought to our attention through the panel.
Thank you.
Can I follow on that question?
Yes. Could you identify those?
So just to clarify, is the work plan going to be a specific sort of task that the GRAS is going to help take on?
The timing on that is challenging. The work plan is due in October, so I think we will answer that question more clearly at the April meeting. And we had thought 2 meetings a year, but it could end up being that the second meeting is in advance of publishing the work plan so that there is an opportunity for input. We haven't made that decision yet, and we'll work with Art and Kelly to determine if that's where we want to put the energy of the GRAS.
Put my vote in for contributing to the work plan.
Okay. Very good.
So noted. Let's go back to location 5 in Ohio. See if Don can connect with us by audio. If not, Lynn, would you mind reading his question?
Sure. So Don says his question is, after the priority product is identified and the exposure analysis is conducted, can that exposure analysis be challenged? So I can only respond as I'm interpreting this question, but I think he's asking, if we identify a priority product, can people challenge, the exposure that we believe to exist to the chemical from the product? And we will be workshopping these, and there'll be that whole rulemaking process where people can submit comments and challenge the information that we have to fill in any data gaps that may exist, and our analysis of the product to say, you're wrong about this exposure information. So that can happen either at the public workshop or through the public and comment period while we're doing the rulemaking to establish the priority products.
Thank you. Don, do you have a follow-up? Okay. I'm not seeing... Oh.
You could hear you typing, but...
Oh, you can? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happened. No, that answered the question at least sufficiently for now. Thank you.
And I see some flags up here in Richmond. So let's go with Julia.
This is Julia Quinn. Yeah, I had a question. I think when you look at an alternative in this regulation, it's reduced hazard or reduced exposure, right? So is that across a number of uses, I would imagine? So you find the product, and the priority product has the COC in it. And so you're looking at reducing, so the alternative qualifies if you've reduced, you don't have to, you can eliminate, but you can also reduce the hazard. So that's per use, right? Okay. Per use of the product? Because the product will have more than one use, I would imagine.
This is Carl. I think the analysis will have to be across the whole life cycle of its use. And the preparer of the analysis will be weighing the relevant factors and balancing out how it works in the mix. So one use might potentially have a more adverse effect than another, but on the whole, the AA has to address that. So I'm not, if that would address what you're asking.
Yeah, well, I know the life cycle, but life cycle is attached to a particular use of a compound, of a product. I mean, if a product is used, I would imagine that a product, we don't have to go into this, but I can imagine that a product could have multiple uses. So that if you're talking about an alternative, their alternatives would have to address reducing both either hazard or both, exposure or the hazard, the hazard of the chemical across those different uses. Otherwise, you're not really accomplishing anything.
I think
I was just clarifying that.
In part, it will be clarified by the listing, which will say what the product and chemical.
So when you list a product, you will say which uses of that product.
Well, we have the latitude. It's not specified. Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong, but we want to make sure that everyone knows what we're capturing and why.
Okay.
And that would frame the AA.
Okay.
So if I think a product did have multiple uses, we would try to make clear what you're.
Yeah, because when you're talking about exposure, it's going to make a difference in terms of,
And we're seeing that with.
Yeah,
there is.
Sure, you have exactly.
So it's going to be a challenge for us.
Right, and I think that's going to be very challenging, to tell you one of the more challenging parts of this, because and you have, and I suspect you're developing criteria for what reducing exposure looks like. In terms of this, because you'll have usage, you'll have this product, and then, you'll have what constitutes a meaningful exposure reduction for the standard. Because, reduces can be interpreted in many ways. It might not be, and with doing this outside of a sort of a potency or risk assessment sort of frame, it gets very difficult to figure out what a meaningful reduction is, both hazard-wise and exposure-wise. So I'm just.
I'm smiling.
Yeah.
We have our work.
Right. No, and that's part of our function, too, to help with that. But I just wanted to clarify that I'm thinking about it in the way that you're thinking about it in terms of what needs to be done.
Excellent. Kelly?
I just wanted to raise, just as more of a thought, we had a couple questions around the review of the AAs and how that would work. And I've been thinking a lot in particular about the reviews of the preliminary AA report. I'm actually more, I have some worries about how that might work and the ability to determine if the right relevant factors are picked for follow-up, because that drives the whole process. And my experience is that if you have somebody go through the whole process of doing an AA and get to the end, and then somebody in the public asks them a question that goes way back up to the scoping exercise, it's all pretty annoying to everybody. And especially the manufacturer might have to generate more data they weren't expecting and those kinds of things. So I just wanted to let you know that I'm thinking about that. I'm seeing some nodding heads in this room for those of you who are on the phone, that this might be something that the department might wish to consult with the panel on as well. So I'm not sure Cal was done with her questions.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just go back to Cal in Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
This is Cal. No, you did not. And I think my question was answered as far as the scope goes. And while I'm on the line, I just want to say I agree with Julia that this question about what's meaningful reduction in either hazard or exposure and how is that quantified, it's a really interesting and challenging question.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question. Helen?
Hi, this is Helen Holder. I wanted to follow up on what Kelly was saying previously about criteria for relevance, and that you had said earlier that if we wanted to make sure things were on the agenda for discussion, that was actually going to be one. What are the criteria for relevance? And more importantly, what is the substantiation of that decision? So we want to want to know, what do you have to do if you exclude something? How do you prove that that's not relevant? Do you have to do the entire analysis to then prove that it's not relevant and doesn't need to be analyzed? So I think that should be somewhere on our agenda.
Yes, excellent point. Well, we're right on time, so let's switch over to agenda item number 9, follow-up and action items. Back to my co-chair, Kelly.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone here, the science panel members and the staff, for a good background briefing. I can tell just from the little tiny bit of discussion that we started here that it's going to be terrific fun to work with you all when we get into our next meeting, which we'll be able to dive right into the substance thanks to everyone's participation in this meeting. At this time, we want to go through any action items that we have in follow-up. I have just one on the list that I was keeping, which was that the DTSC is going to provide the science panel at a time that's appropriate, a list of the staff that we might be working with. Are there other action items that you all have noted?
Posting Lynn's slides with the commentary.
And also wanted to add on to the agenda item.
Okay. And the other thing that I'd like to say is that this was a test of the teleconference system for us, so it was a learning experience, the teleconference webinar system. It was a learning experience, and I want to thank science panel members. Some of you went through some difficulties on here. We're going to learn from that experience, and I know that the staff are eager to learn from that experience, and we'll be exploring that. And any members of the public, I do want to thank you for your patience with some of the difficulties that we had, particularly at the start of the meeting. And if you do have feedback on how that worked, we're trying to learn from this experience because the teleconference meeting is far less expensive for the department, and it's a tool that will allow us to meet more than the 2 times physically per year. And so it's a potential benefit for the department if we can make this system work well. So we're really eager to work on that. So thank you for your patience. Please provide your feedback. And we're looking forward to the next meeting. The first in-person meeting of the science panel will be April 9th and 10th, and this will be in Sacramento. And I got distracted here. So that we anticipate the meeting will focus on alternatives analysis. Do you want to pick this one up, Meredith? And
which one?
What I'm saying here, is this supposed to be you or me, actually?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Either one. But we will send you even more direction about the myriad of documents you receive. But in particular, the regs and the regulations are easier to read if you read the outline format, and if you can read that section on the alternatives analysis, that will give us a great foundation for the discussions next time. And then if you want to move beyond that, within the final statement of reasons, which we provided, there would be a lot of comments that were raised about the alternatives analysis, and you can see the logic behind the choices that were made in terms of how the regs were written.
All right. And in addition to that, there could be additional agenda items, and so stay tuned, because the staff will be working on that and figuring out exactly what they need in that time frame to move stuff along. Before I turn things over to Art, I also particularly wish to thank our presenters today, to thank Lynn, to thank Carl, to thank Meredith, and to thank Corey for getting this all together, and to thank Avelia, who's here in the room with us, making things flow smoothly, which I've really appreciated.
And Greg.
And Greg. I'm sure I'm missing somebody, but it's really been a pleasure to work with these folks, and I'm really looking forward to working with you all moving forward. So,
excellent. If there are no more questions or comments, I officially adjourn this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.